Dedication and Chapter 1 of Anne of the Island. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sweet Pea. Anne of the Island by Maud Montgomery. To all the girls all over the world who have wanted more about Anne. All precious things discovered late, to those that seek them issue forth. For love in sequel works with fate, and draws the veil from hidden worth. Tennyson. Chapter 1. The Shadow of Change. Harvest is ended and summer is gone, quoted Anne Shirley, gazing across the shorn fields dreamily. She and Diana Barry had been picking apples in the Green Gables orchard, but were now resting from their labors in a sunny corner, where airy fleets of thistledown drifted by on the wings of a wind that was still summer-sweet with the incense of ferns in the haunted wood. But everything in the landscape around them spoke of autumn. The sea was roaring hollowly in the distance, the fields were bare and sere, scarfed with goldenrod, the brook valley below Green Gables overflowed with asters of ethereal purple, and the lake of shining waters was blue, 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 not the changeful blue of spring, nor the pale azure of summer, but a clear, steadfast, serene blue, as if the water were past all moods and tenses of emotion, and had settled down to a tranquillity unbroken by fickle dreams. "It has been a nice summer," said Diana, twisting the new ring on her left hand with a smile, "and Miss Lavendar's wedding seemed to come as a sort of crown to it. I suppose Mr. and Mrs. Irving are on the Pacific coast now." "It seems to me they have been gone long enough to go around the world," sighed Anne. "I can't believe it is only a week since they were married. Everything has changed. Miss Lavendar and Mr. and Mrs. Allen gone. How lonely the manse looks with the shutters all closed! I went past it last night, and it made me feel as if everybody in it had died." "We'll never get another minister as nice as Mr. Allen," said Diana with gloomy conviction. "I suppose we'll have all kinds of supplies this winter, and half the Sundays no preaching at all. And you and Gilbert gone, it will be awfully dull." "Fred will be here," insinuated Anne slyly. "When is Mrs. Lynde going to move up?" asked Diana, as if she had not heard Anne's remark. "Tomorrow. I'm glad she's coming, but it will be another change. Marilla and I cleared everything out of the spare room yesterday. Do you know I hated to do it? Of course it was silly, but it did seem as if we were committing sacrilege. That old spare room has always seemed like a shrine to me. When I was a child I thought it the most wonderful apartment in the world. You remember what a consuming desire I had to sleep in a spare room bed, but not the Green Gables spare room. Oh no, never there! It would have been too terrible. I couldn't have slept a wink from awe. I never walked through that room when Marilla sent me in on an errand. No, indeed. I tiptoed through it and held my breath, as if I were in church, and felt relieved when I got out of it. The pictures of George Whitefield and the Duke of Wellington hung there, one on each side of the mirror, and frowned so sternly at me all the time I was in, especially if I dared peep in the mirror, which was the only one in the house that didn't twist my face a little bit. I always wondered how Marilla dared house clean that room, and now it's not only clean but stripped bare. George Whitefield and the Duke have been relegated to the upstairs hall. So passes the glory of this world," concluded Anne, with a laugh in which there was a little note of regret. "It is never pleasant to have our old shrines desecrated, even when we have outgrown them." "I'll be so lonesome when you go," moaned Diana for the 100th time. "And to think you go next week!" "But we're together still," said Anne cheerily. "We mustn't let next week rob us of this week's joy. I hate the thought of going myself. Home and I are such good friends. Talk of being lonesome. It's I who should groan. You'll be here with any number of your old friends and Fred, while I shall be alone among strangers, not knowing a soul." "Except Gilbert and Charlie Sloane," said Diana, imitating Anne's italics and slyness. "Charlie Sloane will be a great comfort, of course," agreed Anne sarcastically, whereupon both these irresponsible damsels laughed. Diana knew exactly what Anne thought of Charlie Sloane, but despite sundry confidential talks she did not know just what Anne thought of Gilbert Blythe. To be sure, Anne herself did not know that. "The boys may be boarding at the other end of Kingsport, for all I know," Anne went on. "I am glad I'm going to Redmond, and I'm sure I shall like it after a while. But for the first few weeks I know I won't. I shan't even have the comfort of looking forward to the weekend visit home, as I had when I went to Queen's. Christmas will seem like 1,000 years away." "Everything is changing, or going to change," said Diana sadly. "I have a feeling that things will never be the same again, Anne." "We have come to a parting of the ways, I suppose," said Anne thoughtfully. "We had to come to it. Do you think, Diana, that being grown up is really as nice as we used to imagine it would be when we were children?" "I don't know. There are some nice things about it," answered Diana, again caressing her ring with that little smile which always had the effect of making Anne feel suddenly left out and inexperienced. "But there are so many puzzling things, too. Sometimes I feel as if being grown up just frightened me, and that I would give anything to be a little girl again." "I suppose we'll get used to being grown up in time," said Anne cheerfully. "There won't be so many unexpected things about it by and by, though after all, I fancy it's the unexpected things that give spice to life. We're 18, Diana. In 2 more years we'll be 20. When I was 10 I thought 20 was a green old age. In no time you'll be a staid middle-aged matron, and I shall be nice old maid Aunt Anne, coming to visit you on vacations. You'll always keep a corner for me, won't you, darling? Not the spare room, of course. Old maids can't aspire to spare rooms, and I shall be as humble as Uriah Heep, and quite content with a little over the porch or off the parlor cubbyhole." "What nonsense you do talk, Anne," laughed Diana. "You'll marry somebody splendid and handsome and rich, and no spare room in Avonlea will be half gorgeous enough for you, and you'll turn up your nose at all the friends of your youth." "That would be a pity. My nose is quite nice, but I fear turning it up would spoil it," said Anne, patting that shapely organ. "I haven't so many good features that I could afford to spoil those I have. So, even if I should marry the King of the Cannibal Islands, I promise you I won't turn up my nose at you, Diana." With another gay laugh the girls separated, Diana to return to Orchard Slope, Anne to walk to the post office. She found a letter awaiting her there, and when Gilbert Blythe overtook her on the bridge over the Lake of Shining Waters, she was sparkling with the excitement of it. "Priscilla Grant is going to Redmond too!" she exclaimed. "Isn't that splendid?" I hoped she would, but she didn't think her father would consent. He has, however, and we're to board together. I feel that I can face an army with banners, or all the professors of Redmond in one fell phalanx, with a chum like Priscilla by my side. "I think we'll like Kingsport," said Gilbert. "It's a nice old burg, they tell me, and has the finest natural park in the world. I've heard that the scenery in it is magnificent." "I wonder if it can be, any more beautiful than this," murmured Anne, looking around her with the loving, enraptured eyes of those to whom home must always be the loveliest spot in the world, no matter what fairer lands may lie under alien stars. They were leaning on the bridge of the old pond, drinking deep of the enchantment of the dusk, just at the spot where Anne had climbed from her sinking dory on the day Elaine floated down to Camelot. The fine empurpling dye of sunset still stained the western skies, but the moon was rising and the water lay like a great silver dream in her light. Remembrance wove a sweet and subtle spell over the 2 young creatures. "You are very quiet, Anne," said Gilbert at last. "I'm afraid to speak or move, for fear all this wonderful beauty will vanish just like a broken silence," breathed Anne. Gilbert suddenly laid his hand over the slender white one lying on the rail of the bridge. His hazel eyes deepened into darkness, his still boyish lips opened to say something of the dream and hope that thrilled his soul. But Anne snatched her hand away and turned quickly. The spell of the dusk was broken for her. "I must go home," she exclaimed, with a rather overdone carelessness. "Marilla had a headache this afternoon, and I'm sure the twins will be in some dreadful mischief by this time. I really shouldn't have stayed away so long." She chattered ceaselessly and inconsequently until they reached the Green Gables lane. Poor Gilbert hardly had a chance to get a word in edgewise. Anne felt rather relieved when they parted. There had been a new secret self-consciousness in her heart with regard to Gilbert ever since that fleeting moment of revelation in the garden of Echo Lodge. Something alien had intruded into the old perfect schoolday comradeship, something that threatened to mar it. "I never felt glad to see Gilbert go before," she thought, half resentfully, half sorrowfully, as she walked alone up the lane. "Our friendship will be spoiled if he goes on with this nonsense. It mustn't be spoiled. I won't let it. Oh, why can't boys be just sensible?" Anne had an uneasy doubt that it was not strictly sensible that she should still feel on her hand the warm pressure of Gilbert's, as distinctly as she had felt it for the swift second his hand had rested there, and still less sensible that the sensation was far from being an unpleasant one, very different from that which had attended a similar demonstration on Charlie Sloane's part, when she had been sitting out a dance with him at White Sands party 3 nights before. Anne shivered over the disagreeable recollection, but all problems connected with infatuated swains vanished from her mind when she entered the homely, unsentimental atmosphere of the Green Gables kitchen, where an 8-year-old boy was crying grievously on the sofa. "What is the matter, Davy?" asked Anne, taking him up in her arms. "Where are Marilla and Dora?" "Marilla's putting Dora to bed," sobbed Davy, "and I'm crying 'cause Dora fell down the outside cellar steps, heels over head, and scraped all the skin off her nose and—" "Oh, well, don't cry about it, dear. Of course you are sorry for her, but crying won't help her any. She'll be all right tomorrow. Crying never helps anyone, Davy boy, and—" "I ain't crying 'cause Dora fell down the cellar," said Davy, cutting short Anne's well-meant preachment with increasing bitterness. "I'm crying 'cause I wasn't there to see her fall. I'm always missing some fun or other, seems to me. Oh, Davy!" Anne choked back an unholy shriek of laughter. "Would you call it fun to see poor little Dora fall down the steps and get hurt?" "She wasn't much hurt," said Davy defiantly. "'Course, if she'd been killed, I'd been real sorry, Anne. But the Keiths ain't so easy killed. They're like the Blewetts, I guess. Herb Blewett fell off the hayloft last Wednesday and rolled right down through the turnip chute into the box stall where they had a fearful wild cross horse, and rolled right under his heels. And still he got out alive, with only 3 bones broke. Mrs. Lynde says there are some folks you can't kill with a meat axe. Is Mrs. Lynde coming here tomorrow, Anne?" "Yes, Davy, and I hope you'll always be very nice and good to her." "I'll be nice and good. But will she ever put me to bed at nights, Anne?" "Perhaps. Why?" "'Cause," said Davy very decidedly, "if she does, I won't say my prayers before her like I do before you, Anne." "Why not?" "'Cause I don't think it would be nice to talk to God before strangers, Anne. Dora can say hers to Mrs. Lynde if she likes, but I won't. I'll wait till she's gone and then say 'em. Won't that be all right, Anne?" "Yes, if you are sure you won't forget to say them, Davy boy." "Oh, I won't forget, you bet. I think saying my prayers is great fun, but it won't be as good fun saying them alone as saying them to you. I wish you'd stay home, Anne. I don't see what you want to go away and leave us for." "I don't exactly want to, Davy, but I feel I ought to go. If you don't want to go, you needn't. You're grown up. When I'm grown up, I'm not going to do one single thing I don't want to, Anne." "All your life, Davy, you'll find yourself doing things you don't want to do." "I won't," said Davy flatly. "Catch me. I have to do things I don't want to now, 'cause you and Marilla'll send me to bed if I don't. But when I grow up you can't do that, and there'll be nobody to tell me not to do things. Won't I have the time! Say, Anne, Milty Boulter says his mother says you're going to college to see if you can catch a man. Are you, Anne? I want to know." For a second Anne burned with resentment. Then she laughed, reminding herself that Mrs. Boulter's crude vulgarity of thought and speech could not harm her. "No, Davy, I'm not. I'm going to study and grow and learn about many things." "What things?" "Shoes and ships and sealing wax and cabbages and kings," quoted Anne. "But if you did want to catch a man, how would you go about it? I want to know," persisted Davy, for whom the subject evidently possessed a certain fascination. "You'd better ask Mrs. Boulter," said Anne thoughtlessly. "I think it's likely she knows more about the process than I do." "I will the next time I see her," said Davy gravely. "Davy, if you do!" cried Anne, realizing her mistake. "But you just told me to," protested Davy, aggrieved. "It's time you went to bed," decreed Anne, by way of getting out of the scrape. After Davy had gone to bed, Anne wandered down to Victoria Island and sat there alone, curtained with fine spun moonlit gloom, while the water laughed around her in its duet of brook and wind. Anne had always loved that brook. Many a dream had she spun over its sparkling waters in days gone by. She forgot lovelorn youths and the cayenne speeches of malicious neighbors and all the problems of her girlish existence. In imagination she sailed over storied seas that washed the distant shining shores of fairy lands forlorn, where lost Atlantis and Elysium lie, with the evening star for pilot to the land of heart's desire. And she was richer in those dreams than in realities, for things seen pass away, but the things that are unseen are eternal. End of chapter 1. Recording by Sweet Pea. Chapter 2 of Anne of the Island by Maud Montgomery. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sweet Pea. Chapter 2. Garlands of Autumn. The following week sped swiftly, crowded with innumerable last things, as Anne called them. Good-bye calls had to be made and received, being pleasant or otherwise, according to whether callers and called upon were heartily in sympathy with Anne's hopes, or thought she was too much puffed up over going to college, and that it was their duty to take her down a peg or two. The AVIS gave a farewell party in honor of Anne and Gilbert one evening, at the home of Josie Pye, choosing that place, partly because Mr. Pye's house was large and convenient, partly because it was strongly suspected that the Pye girls would have nothing to do with the affair if their offer of the house for the party was not accepted. It was a very pleasant little time, for the Pye girls were gracious, and said and did nothing to mar the harmony of the occasion, which was not according to their wont. Josie was unusually amiable, so much so that she even remarked condescendingly to Anne, "Your new dress is rather becoming you, Anne. Really, you look almost pretty in it." "How kind of you to say so," responded Anne, with dancing eyes. Her sense of humor was developing, and the speeches that would have hurt her at 14 were becoming merely food for amusement now. Josie suspected that Anne was laughing at her behind those wicked eyes, but she contented herself with whispering to Gertie, as they went downstairs, that Anne Shirley would put on more airs than ever now that she was going to college. "You'd see." All the old crowd was there, full of mirth and zest and youthful light-heartedness. Diana Barry, rosy and dimpled, shadowed by the faithful Fred. Jane Andrews, neat and sensible and plain. Ruby Gillis, looking her handsomest and brightest in a cream silk blouse with red geraniums in her golden hair. Gilbert Blythe and Charlie Sloane, both trying to keep as near the elusive Anne as possible. Carrie Sloane, looking pale and melancholy because, so it was reported, her father would not allow Oliver Kimball to come near the place. Moody Spurgeon Macpherson, whose round face and objectionable ears were as round and objectionable as ever, and Billy Andrews, who sat in a corner all the evening, chuckled when anyone spoke to him, and watched Anne Shirley with a grin of pleasure on his broad, freckled countenance. Anne had known beforehand of the party, but she had not known that she and Gilbert were, as the founders of the society, to be presented with a very complimentary address and tokens of respect. In her case a volume of Shakespeare's plays, in Gilbert's a fountain pen. She was so taken by surprise and pleased by the nice things said in the address, read in Moody Spurgeon's most solemn and ministerial tones, that the tears quite drowned the sparkle of her big gray eyes. She had worked hard and faithfully for the AVIS, and it warmed the cockles of her heart that the members appreciated her efforts so sincerely. And they were all so nice and friendly and jolly. Even the Pye girls had their merits. At the moment Anne loved all the world. She enjoyed the evening tremendously, but the end of it rather spoiled all. Gilbert again made the mistake of saying something sentimental to her as they ate their supper on the moonlit veranda, and Anne, to punish him, was gracious to Charlie Sloane and allowed the latter to walk home with her. She found, however, that revenge hurts nobody quite so much as the one who tries to inflict it. Gilbert walked airily off with Ruby Gillis, and Anne could hear them laughing and talking gaily as they loitered along in the still, crisp autumn air. They were evidently having the best of good times, while she was horribly bored by Charlie Sloane, who talked unbrokenly on and never, even by accident, said one thing that was worth listening to. Anne gave an occasional absent "yes" or "no," and thought how beautiful Ruby had looked that night, how very goggly Charlie's eyes were in the moonlight, worse even than by daylight, and that the world somehow wasn't quite such a nice place as she had believed it to be earlier in the evening. "I'm just tired out, that is what is the matter with me," she said, when she thankfully found herself alone in her own room, and she honestly believed it was. But a certain little gush of joy, as from some secret, unknown spring, bubbled up in her heart the next evening when she saw Gilbert striding down through the haunted wood and crossing the old log bridge with that firm, quick step of his. So Gilbert was not going to spend this last evening with Ruby Gillis, after all. "You look tired, Anne," he said. "I am tired, and worse than that, I'm disgruntled. I'm tired because I've been packing my trunk and sewing all day. But I'm disgruntled because 6 women have been here to say good-bye to me, and every one of the 6 managed to say something that seemed to take the color right out of life and leave it as gray and dismal and cheerless as a November morning." "Spiteful old cats," was Gilbert's elegant comment. "Oh, no, they weren't," said Anne seriously. "That is just the trouble. If they had been spiteful cats I wouldn't have minded them. But they are all nice, kind, motherly souls who like me and whom I like, and that is why what they said or hinted had such undue weight with me. They let me see they thought I was crazy going to Redmond and trying to take a B.A., and ever since I've been wondering if I am." Mrs. Peter Sloane sighed and said she hoped my strength would hold out till I got through, and at once I saw myself a hopeless victim of nervous prostration at the end of my 3rd year. Mrs. Eben Wright said that it must cost an awful lot to put in 4 years at Redmond, and I felt all over me that it was unpardonable of me to squander Marilla's money and my own on such a folly. Mrs. Jasper Bell said she hoped I wouldn't let college spoil me as it did some people, and I felt in my bones that the end of my 4 Redmond years would see me a most insufferable creature, thinking I knew it all, and looking down on everything and everybody in Avonlea. Mrs. Elisha Wright said she understood that Redmond girls, especially those who belonged to Kingsport, were dreadful dressy and stuck up, and she guessed I wouldn't feel much at home among them, and I saw myself a snubbed, dowdy, humiliated country girl, shuffling through Redmond's classic halls in copper-toned boots. Anne ended with a laugh and a sigh commingled. With her sensitive nature, all disapproval had weight, even the disapproval of those for whose opinions she had scant respect. For the time being life was savorless, and ambition had gone out like a snuffed candle. "You surely don't care for what they said," protested Gilbert. "You know exactly how narrow their outlook on life is, excellent creatures though they are. To do anything they have never done is anathema marantha. You are the first Avonlea girl who has ever gone to college, and you know that all pioneers are considered to be afflicted with moonstruck madness." "Oh, I know, but feeling is so different from knowing. My common sense tells me all you can say, but there are times when common sense has no power over me. Common nonsense takes possession of my soul. Really, after Mrs. Elisha went away, I hardly had the heart to finish packing." "You're just tired, Anne. Come, forget it all and take a walk with me, a ramble back through the woods beyond the marsh. There should be something there I want to show you." "Should be? Don't you know if it is there?" "No, I only know it should be from something I saw there in spring. Come on, we'll pretend we are 2 children again and we'll go the way of the wind." They started gaily off. Anne, remembering the unpleasantness of the preceding evening, was very nice to Gilbert, and Gilbert, who was learning wisdom, took care to be nothing save the schoolboy comrade again. Mrs. Lynde and Marilla watched them from the kitchen window. "That'll be a match some day," Mrs. Lynde said approvingly. Marilla winced slightly. In her heart she hoped it would, but it went against her grain to hear the matter spoken of in Mrs. Lynde's gossipy, matter-of-fact way. "They're only children yet," she said shortly. Mrs. Lynde laughed good-naturedly. "Anne is 18. I was married when I was that age. We old folks, Marilla, are too much given to thinking children never grow up, that's what."
Anne is a young woman and Gilbert's a man, and he worships the ground she walks on, as anyone can see. He's a fine fellow, and Anne can't do better. I hope she won't get any romantic nonsense into her head at Redmond. I don't approve of them co-educational places and never did, that's what. I don't believe," concluded Mrs. Lynde solemnly, "that the students in such colleges ever do much else than flirt." "They must study a little," said Marilla with a smile. "Precious little," sniffed Mrs. Rachel. "However, I think Anne will. She never was flirtatious. But she doesn't appreciate Gilbert at his full value, that's what. Oh, I know girls. Charlie Sloane is wild about her, too. But I'd never advise her to marry a Sloane. The Sloanes are good, honest, respectable people, of course. But when all's said and done, they're Sloanes." Marilla nodded. To an outsider, the statement that Sloanes were Sloanes might not be very illuminating, but she understood. Every village has such a family. Good, honest, respectable people they may be, but Sloanes they are, and must ever remain, though they speak with the tongues of men and angels. Gilbert and Anne, happily unconscious that their future was thus being settled by Mrs. Rachel, were sauntering through shadows of the haunted wood. Beyond, the harvest hills were basking in an amber sunset radiance, under a pale aerial sky of rose and blue. The distant spruce groves were burnished bronze, and their long shadows barred the upland meadows, but around them a little wind sang among the fir tassels, and in it there was the note of autumn. "This wood really is haunted now by old memories," said Anne, stooping to gather a spray of ferns bleached to waxen whiteness by frost. "It seems to me that the little girls Diana and I used to be play here still, and sit by the Dryad's Bubble in the twilights, trysting with the ghosts. Do you know, I can never go up this path in the dusk without feeling a bit of the old fright and shiver. There was one especially horrifying phantom which we created, the ghost of the murdered child that crept up behind you and laid cold fingers on yours. I confess that, to this day, I cannot help fancying its little furtive footsteps behind me when I come here after nightfall. I'm not afraid of the White Lady or the Headless Man or the skeletons, but I wish I had never imagined that baby's ghost into existence. How angry Marilla and Mrs. Barry were over that affair," concluded Anne with reminiscent laughter. The woods around the head of the marsh were full of purple vistas threaded with gossamers. Past a dour plantation of gnarled spruces and maple-fringed Sunworm Valley they found the something Gilbert was looking for. "Ah, here it is," he said with satisfaction. "An apple tree, and away back here!" exclaimed Anne delightedly. "Yes, a veritable apple-bearing apple tree, too, here in the very midst of pines and beeches, a mile away from any orchard. I was here one day last spring and found it all white with blossom. So I resolved I'd come again in the fall and see if it had been apples. See, it's loaded. They look good, too, tawny as russets, but with a dusky red cheek. Most wild seedlings are green and uninviting. Here's a fallen tree with a cushion of moss. Sit down, Anne. It will serve for a woodland throne. I'll climb for some apples. They all grow high. The tree had to reach up to the sunlight." The apples proved to be delicious. Under the tawny skin was a white flesh, faintly veined with red, and besides their own proper apple taste, they had a certain wild, delightful tang no orchard-grown apple ever possessed. "The fatal apple of Eden couldn't have had a rarer flavor," commented Anne. "But it's time we were going home. See, it was twilight 3 minutes ago, and now it's moonlight. What a pity we couldn't have caught the moment of transformation. But such moments never are caught, I suppose. Let's go back around the marsh and home by way of Lover's Lane. Do you feel as disgruntled now as when you started out, Anne?" "Not I. Those apples have been as manna to a hungry soul. I feel that I shall love Redmond and have a splendid 4 years there." "And after those 4 years, what?" "Oh, there's another bend in the road at their end," answered Anne lightly. "I've no idea what may be around it. I don't want to have. It's nicer not to know." Lover's Lane was a dear place that night, still and mysteriously dim in the pale radiance of the moonlight.
They loitered through it in a pleasant chummy silence, neither caring to talk. If Gilbert were always as he has been this evening, how nice and simple everything would be, reflected Anne. Gilbert was looking at Anne as she walked along. In her light dress, with her slender delicacy, she made him think of a white iris. I wonder if I can ever make her care for me, he thought, with a pang of self-distrust. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sweet Pea. Chapter 2. Greeting and Farewell. Charlie Sloane, Gilbert Blythe, and Anne Shirley left Avonlea the following Monday morning. Anne had hoped for a fine day. Diana was to drive her to the station, and they wanted this, their last drive together for some time, to be a pleasant one. But when Anne went to bed Sunday night, the east wind was moaning around Green Gables with an ominous prophecy which was fulfilled in the morning. Anne awoke to find raindrops pattering against her window and shadowing the pond's gray surface with widening rings. Hills and sea were hidden in mist, and the whole world seemed dim and dreary. Anne dressed in the cheerless gray dawn, for an early start was necessary to catch the boat train. She struggled against the tears that would well up in her eyes in spite of herself. She was leaving the home that was so dear to her, and something told her that she was leaving it forever, save as a holiday refuge. Things would never be the same again. Coming back for vacations would not be living there. And oh, how dear and beloved everything was! That little white porch room, sacred to the dreams of girlhood, the old Snow Queen at the window, the brook in the hollow, the Dryad's Bubble, the haunted woods, and Lover's Lane, all the 1,001 dear spots where memories of the old years bided. Could she ever be really happy anywhere else? Breakfast at Green Gables that morning was a rather doleful meal. Davy, for the first time in his life probably, could not eat, but blubbered shamelessly over his porridge. Nobody else seemed to have much appetite, save Dora, who tucked away her rations comfortably. Dora, like the immortal and most prudent Charlotte, who "went on cutting bread and butter" when her frenzied lover's body had been carried past on a shutter, was one of those fortunate creatures who are seldom disturbed by anything. Even at 8 it took a great deal to ruffle Dora's placidity. She was sorry Anne was going away, of course, but was that any reason why she should fail to appreciate a poached egg on toast? Not at all. And, seeing that Davy could not eat his, Dora ate it for him. Promptly on time, Diana appeared with horse and buggy, her rosy face glowing above her raincoat. The good-byes had to be said then somehow. Mrs. Lynde came in from her quarters to give Anne a hearty embrace and warn her to be careful of her health, whatever she did. Marilla, brusque and tearless, pecked Anne's cheek and said she supposed they'd hear from her when she got settled. A casual observer might have concluded that Anne's going mattered very little to her, unless said observer had happened to get a good look in her eyes. Dora kissed Anne primly and then squeezed out 2 decorous little tears, but Davy, who had been crying on the back porch step ever since they rose from the table, refused to say any good-bye at all. When he saw Anne coming towards him, he sprang to his feet, bolted up the back stairs, and hid in a clothes closet, out of which he would not come. His muffled howls were the last sounds Anne heard as she left Green Gables. It rained heavily all the way to Bright River, to which station they had to go, since the branch line train from Carmody did not connect with the boat train. Charlie and Gilbert were on the station platform when they reached it, and the train was whistling. Anne had just time to get her ticket and trunk checked, say a hurried farewell to Diana, and hasten on board. She wished she were going back with Diana to Avonlea. She knew she was going to die of homesickness. And oh, if only that dismal rain would stop pouring down as if the whole world were weeping over summer vanished and joys departed! Even Gilbert's presence brought her no comfort, for Charlie Sloane was there too, and Sloanishness could be tolerated only in fine weather. It was absolutely insufferable in rain. But when the boat steamed out of Charlottetown harbor, things took a turn for the better. The rain ceased, and the sun began to burst out goldenly now and again between the rents in the clouds, burnishing the gray seas with copper-hued radiance, and lighting up the mists that curtained the island's red shores with gleams of gold, foretokening a fine day after all. Besides, Charlie Sloane promptly became so seasick that he had to go below, and Anne and Gilbert were left alone on deck. "I am very glad that all the Sloanes get seasick as soon as they go on water," thought Anne mercilessly. "I am sure I couldn't take my farewell look at the old sod with Charlie standing there pretending to look sentimentally at it too." "Well, we're off," remarked Gilbert unsentimentally. "Yes, I feel like Byron's Childe Harold, only it isn't really my native shore that I'm watching," said Anne, winking her gray eyes vigorously. "Nova Scotia is that, I suppose. But one's native shore is the land one loves the best, and that's good old PEI for me. I can't believe I didn't always live here. Those 11 years before I came seem like a bad dream. It's 7 years since I crossed on this boat, the evening Mrs. Spencer brought me over from Hopetown. I can see myself, in that dreadful old wincey dress and faded sailor hat, exploring decks and cabins with enraptured curiosity. It was a fine evening, and how those red island shores did gleam in the sunshine. Now I'm crossing the strait again. Oh, Gilbert, I do hope I'll like Redmond and Kingsport, but I'm sure I won't." "Where's all your philosophy gone, Anne?" "It's all submerged under a great swamping wave of loneliness and homesickness. I've longed for 3 years to go to Redmond, and now I'm going, and I wish I weren't. Never mind, I shall be cheerful and philosophical again after I have had just one good cry. I must have that, as a went, and I'll have to wait until I get into my boarding-house bed tonight, wherever it may be, before I can have it. Then Anne will be herself again. I wonder if Davy has come out of the closet yet." It was 9 that night when their train reached Kingsport, and they found themselves in the blue-white glare of the crowded station. Anne felt horribly bewildered, but a moment later she was seized by Priscilla Grant, who had come to Kingsport on Saturday. "Here you are, beloved, and I suppose you're as tired as I was when I got here Saturday night." "Tired! Priscilla, don't talk of it. I'm tired and green and provincial, and only about 10 years old. For pity's sake take your poor broken-down chum to some place where she can hear herself think." "I'll take you right up to our boarding-house. I've a cab ready outside." "It's such a blessing you're here, Prissy. If you weren't, I think I should just sit down on my suitcase here and now and weep bitter tears. What a comfort one familiar face is in a howling wilderness of strangers. How he has grown up this past year. He was only a schoolboy when I taught in Carmody. And of course that's Charlie Sloane. He hasn't changed. Couldn't. He looked just like that when he was born, and he'll look like that when he's 80. This way, dear. We'll be home in 20 minutes. "Home," groaned Anne. "You mean we'll be in some horrible boarding-house in a still more horrible hall bedroom looking out on a dingy backyard." "It isn't a horrible boarding-house, Anne girl. Here's our cab. Hop in, the driver will get your trunk." "Oh, yes, the boarding-house. It's really a very nice place of its kind, as you'll admit tomorrow morning when a good night's sleep has turned your blues rosy pink. It's a big old-fashioned gray stone house on St. John's Street, just a nice little constitutional from Redmond. It used to be the residence of great folk, but fashion has deserted St. John's Street, and its houses only dream now of better days. They're so big that people living in them have to take boarders just to fill up. At least that is the reason our landladies are very anxious to impress on us. They're delicious, Anne. Our landladies, I mean." "How many are there?" "Two. Miss Hannah Harvey and Miss Ada Harvey. They were born twins about 50 years ago." "I can't get away from twins, it seems," smiled Anne. "Wherever I go they confront me." "Oh, they're not twins now, dear. After they reached the age of 30 they never were twins again. Miss Hannah has grown old, not too gracefully, and Miss Ada has stayed 30, less gracefully still. I don't know whether Miss Hannah can smile or not. I've never caught it at it so far. But Miss Ada smiles all the time, and that's worse. However, they're nice, kind souls, and they take 2 boarders every year, because Miss Hannah's economical soul cannot bear to waste room space, not because they need to or have to, as Miss Ada has told me 7 times since Saturday night. As for our rooms, I admit they are hall bedrooms, and mine does look out on the backyard. Your room is a front one, and looks on an old St. John's graveyard, which is just across the street." "That sounds gruesome," shivered Anne. "I think I'd rather have the backyard view." "Oh, no, you wouldn't. Wait and see. Old St. John's is a darling place. It's been a graveyard so long that it ceased to be one and has become one of the sights of Kingsport. I was all through it yesterday for a pleasure exertion. There's a big stone wall, and a row of enormous trees all around it, and rows of trees all through it, and the queerest old tombstones with the queerest and quaintest inscriptions. You'll go there to study, Anne, see if you don't. Of course, nobody is ever buried there now, but a few years ago they put up a beautiful monument to the memory of Nova Scotian soldiers who fell in the Crimean War. It's just opposite the entrance gates, and there's scope for imagination in it, as you used to say. Here's your trunk at last, and the boys coming to say good night. Must I really shake hands with Charlie Sloane, Anne? His hands are always so cold and fishy-feeling. We must ask them to call occasionally. Miss Hannah gravely told me we could have young gentlemen callers 2 evenings in the week if they went away at a reasonable hour, and Miss Ada asked me, smiling, please to be sure they didn't sit on her beautiful cushions. I promised to see to it, but goodness knows where else they can sit, unless they sit on the floor, for there are cushions on everything. Miss Ada even has an elaborate Battenberg one on top of the piano." Anne was laughing by this time. Priscilla's gay chatter had the intended effect of cheering her up. Homesickness vanished for the time being, and did not even return in full force when she finally found herself alone in her little bedroom. She went to her window and looked out. The street below was dim and quiet. Across it the moon was shining above the trees in Old St. John's, just behind the great dark head of the lion on the monument. Anne wondered if it could have been only that morning that she had left Green Gables. She had the sense of a long passage of time, which one day of change and travel gives. "I suppose that very moon is looking down on Green Gables now," she mused, "but I won't think about it. That way homesickness lies. I'm not even going to have my good cry. I'll put that off to a more convenient season, and just now I'll go calmly and sensibly to bed and sleep." End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sweet Pea. Chapter 4. April's Lady. Kingsport is a quaint old town, harking back to early colonial days, and wrapped in its ancient atmosphere as some fine old dame in garments fashioned like those of her youth. Here and there it sprouts out into modernity, but at heart it is still unspoiled. It is full of curious relics and haloed by the romance of many legends of the past. Once it was a mere frontier station on the fringe of the wilderness, and those were the days when Indians kept life from being monotonous to the settlers. Then it grew to be a bone of contention between the British and the French, being occupied now by the one and now by the other, emerging from each occupation with some fresh scar of battling nations branded on it. It has in its park a Martello tower autographed all over by tourists, a dismantled old French fort on the hills beyond the town, and several antiquated cannon in its public squares. It has other historic spots also, which may be hunted out by the curious, and none is more quaint and delightful than Old St. John's Cemetery, at the very core of the town, with streets of quiet old-time houses on 2 sides, and busy, bustling, modern thoroughfares on the others. Every citizen of Kingsport feels a thrill of possessive pride in Old St. John's, for, if he be of any pretensions at all, he has an ancestor buried there, with a queer crooked slab at his head, or else sprawling protectively over the grave, on which all the main facts of his history are recorded. For the most part no great art or skill was on those old tombstones. The larger number are of roughly chiseled brown or gray native stone, and only in a few cases is there any attempt at ornamentation. Some are adorned with skull and crossbones, and this grisly decoration is frequently coupled with a cherub's head. Many are prostrate and in ruins. Into almost all Time's tooth has been gnawing, until some inscriptions have been completely effaced, and others can only be deciphered with difficulty. The graveyard is very full and very bowery, for it is surrounded and intersected by rows of elms and willows, beneath whose shade the sleepers must lie very dreamlessly, forever crooned to by the winds and leaves over them, and quite undisturbed by the clamour of traffic just beyond. Anne took the first of many rambles in Old St. John's the next afternoon. She and Priscilla had gone to Redmond in the forenoon, and registered as students, after which there was nothing more to do that day. The girls gladly made their escape, for it was not exhilarating to be surrounded by crowds of strangers, most of whom had a rather alien appearance, as if not quite sure where they belonged. The freshettes stood around in detached groups of 2 or 3, looking askance at each other. The freshies, wiser in their day and generation, had banded themselves together on the big staircase of the entrance hall, where they were shouting out glees with all the vigor of youthful lungs, as a species of defiance to their traditional enemies, the sophomores, a few of whom were prowling loftily about, looking properly disdainful of the unlicked cubs on the stairs. Gilbert and Charlie were nowhere to be seen. "Little did I think the day would ever come when I'd be glad of the sight of a Sloane," said Priscilla as they crossed the campus, "but I'd welcome Charlie's goggle eyes almost ecstatically. At least, they'd be familiar eyes." "Oh," sighed Anne, "I can't describe how I felt when I was standing there, waiting my turn to be registered, as insignificant as the teeniest drop in a most enormous bucket. It's bad enough to feel insignificant, but it's unbearable to have it grained into your soul that you will never, can never, be anything but insignificant, and that is how I did feel, as if I were invisible to the naked eye, and some of those Sophs might step on me. I knew I would go down to my grave unwept, unhonored, and unsung." "Wait till next year," comforted Priscilla. "Then we'll be able to look as bored and sophisticated as any sophomore of them all. No doubt it is rather dreadful to feel insignificant, but I think it's better than to feel as big and awkward as I did, as if I were sprawled all over Redmond. That's how I felt, I suppose because I was a good 2 inches taller than anyone else in the crowd. I wasn't afraid a Soph might walk over me. I was afraid they'd take me for an elephant, or an overgrown sample of a potato-fed islander." "I suppose the trouble is we can't forgive big Redmond for not being little Queen's," said Anne, gathering about her the shreds of her old cheerful philosophy to cover her nakedness of spirit. "When we left Queen's we knew everybody and had a place of our own. I suppose we have been unconsciously expecting to take life up at Redmond just where we left off at Queen's, and now we feel as if the ground had slipped from under our feet. I'm thankful that neither Mrs. Lynde nor Mrs. Elisha Wright know, or ever will know, my state of mind at present. They would exult in saying 'I told you so,' and be convinced it was the beginning of the end, whereas it is just the end of the beginning." "Exactly. That sounds more Annish. In a little while we'll be acclimated and acquainted, and all will be well. And did you notice the girl who stood alone just outside the door of the Codes' dressing room all the morning? The pretty one with brown eyes and crooked mouth?" "Yes, I did. I noticed her particularly because she seemed the only creature there who looked as lonely and friendless as I felt. I had you, but she had no one. I think she felt pretty all by herselfish, too. Several times I saw her make a motion as if to cross over to us, but she never did it. Too shy, I suppose. I wished she would come. If I hadn't felt so much like the aforesaid elephant, I'd have gone to her. But I couldn't lumber across that big hall with all those boys howling on the stairs. She was the prettiest freshette I saw today, but probably favor is deceitful and even beauty is vain on your first day at Redmond," concluded Priscilla with a laugh. "I'm going across to old St. John's after lunch," said Anne. "I don't know that a graveyard is a very good place to get cheered up, but it seems the only get-at-able place where there are trees, and trees I must have. I'll sit on one of those old slabs and shut my eyes and imagine I'm in the Avonlea woods." Anne did not do that, however, for she found enough interest in old St. John's to keep her eyes wide open. They went in by the entrance gates, past the simple massive stone arch surmounted by the great Lion of England. "And on Inkerman yet the wild bramble is gory, and those bleak heights henceforth shall be famous in story," quoted Anne, looking at it with a thrill. They found themselves in a dim, cool, green place where winds were fond of purring. Up and down the long grassy aisles they wandered, reading quaint voluminous epitaphs, carved in an age that had more leisure than our own. "Here lieth the body of Albert Crawford, Esquire," read Anne from a worn gray slab, "for many years keeper of His Majesty's Ordnance at Kingsport. He served in the army till the peace of 1763, when he retired from bad health. He was a brave officer, the best of husbands, the best of fathers, the best of friends. He died October 29th, 1792, aged 84 years. There's an epitaph for you, Prissy. There is certainly some scope for imagination in it. How full such a life must have been of adventure! And as for his personal qualities, I'm sure human eulogy couldn't go further. I wonder if they told him he was all those best things while he was alive." "Here's another," said Priscilla. "Listen. To the memory of Alexander Ross, who died on the 22nd of September, aged 1840, aged 43 years. This is raised as a tribute of affection by one whom he served so faithfully for 27 years that he was regarded as a friend, deserving the fullest confidence and attachment. A very good epitaph, commented Anne thoughtfully. I wouldn't wish a better. We are all servants of some sort, and if the fact that we are faithful can be truthfully inscribed on our tombstones, nothing more need be added. Here's a sorrowful little gray stone, Prissy, to the memory of a favorite child. And here's another, erected to the memory of one who is buried elsewhere. I wonder where that unknown grave is. Really, Priss, the graveyards of today will never be as interesting as this. You were right. I shall come here often. I love it already. I see we're not alone here. There's a girl down at the end of this avenue. Yes, and I believe it's the very girl we saw at Redmond this morning. I've been watching her for 5 minutes. She has started to come up the avenue exactly half a dozen times, and half a dozen times has she turned and gone back. Either she's dreadfully shy, or she has got something on her conscience. Let's go and meet her. It's easier to get acquainted in a graveyard than at Redmond, I believe. They walked down the long grassy arcade towards the stranger, who was sitting on a gray slab under an enormous willow. She was certainly very pretty, with a vivid, irregular, bewitching type of prettiness. There was a gloss as of brown nuts on her satin-smooth hair, and a soft, ripe glow on her round cheeks. Her eyes were big and brown and velvety, under oddly pointed black brows, and her crooked mouth was rose-red. She wore a smart brown suit with 2 very modish little shoes peeping from beneath it, and her hat of dull pink straw, wreathed with golden brown poppies, had the indefinable, unmistakable air which pertains to the creation of an artist in millinery. Priscilla had a sudden stinging conscience that her own had been trimmed by her village store milliner, and Anne wondered uncomfortably if the blouse she had made herself, and which Mrs. Lynde had fitted, looked very countrified and homemade beside the stranger's smart attire. For a moment both girls felt like turning back. But they had already stopped and turned towards the gray slab. It was too late to retreat, for the brown-eyed girl had evidently concluded that they were coming to speak to her. Instantly she sprang up and came forward with outstretched hand and a gay, friendly smile, in which there seemed not a shadow of either shyness or burdened conscience. "Oh, I want to know who you 2 girls are!" she exclaimed eagerly. "I've been dying to know. I saw you at Redmond this morning. Say, wasn't it awful there? For the time I wished I had stayed home and got married." Anne and Priscilla both broke into unconstrained laughter at this unexpected conclusion. The brown-eyed girl laughed too. "I really did. I could have, you know. Come, let's all sit down on this gravestone and get acquainted. It won't be hard. I know we're going to adore each other. I knew it as soon as I saw you at Redmond this morning. I wanted so much to go right over and hug you both." "Why didn't you?" asked Priscilla. "Because I simply couldn't make up my mind to do it. I never can make up my mind about anything myself. I'm always afflicted with indecision. Just as soon as I decide to do something, I feel in my bones that another course would be the correct one. It's a dreadful misfortune, but I was born that way, and there is no use in blaming me for it, as some people do. So I couldn't make up my mind to go and speak to you, much as I wanted to." "We thought you were too shy," said Anne. "No, no, dear. Shyness isn't among the many failings, or virtues, of Philippa Garden. Phil for short. Do call me Phil right off. Now what are your handles?" "She's Priscilla Grant," said Anne, pointing. "And she's Anne Shirley," said Priscilla, pointing in turn. "And we're from the island," said both together. "I hail from Bolingbroke, Nova Scotia," said Philippa. "Bolingbroke!" exclaimed Anne. "Why, that is where I was born." "Do you really mean it? Why, that makes you a Bluenose after all." "No, it doesn't," retorted Anne. "Wasn't it Dan O'Connell who said that if a man was born in a stable it didn't make him a horse? I'm Island to the core." "Well, I'm glad you were born in Bolingbroke, anyway. It makes us kind of neighbors, doesn't it? And I like that, because when I tell you secrets it won't be as if I were telling them to a stranger. I have to tell them. I can't keep secrets. It's no use to try. That's my worst failing. That and indecision, as aforesaid. Would you believe it? It took me half an hour to decide which hat to wear when I was coming here, to a graveyard. At first I inclined to my brown one with the feather, but as soon as I put it on I thought this pink one with the floppy brim would be more becoming. When I got it pinned in place I liked the brown one better. At last I put them close together on the bed, shut my eyes, and jabbed with a hat pin." The pin speared the pink one, so I put it on. It is becoming, isn't it? Tell me, what do you think of my looks?" At this naive demand, made in a perfectly serious tone, Priscilla laughed again. But Anne said, impulsively squeezing Philippa's hand, "We thought this morning that you were the prettiest girl we saw at Redmond." Philippa's crooked mouth flashed into a bewitching crooked smile over very white little teeth. I thought that myself, was her next astounding statement, but I wanted someone else's opinion to bolster mine up. I can't decide even on my own appearance. Just as soon as I've decided that I'm pretty, I begin to feel miserably that I'm not. Besides, I have a horrible old great aunt who is always saying to me with a mournful sigh, "You were such a pretty baby. It's strange how children change when they grow up." I adore aunts, but I detest great aunts. Please tell me quite often that I am pretty, if you don't mind. I feel so much more comfortable when I can believe I'm pretty. And I'll be just as obliging to you if you want me to. I can be with a clear conscience. "Thanks," laughed Anne, "but Priscilla and I are so firmly convinced of our own good looks that we don't need any assurance about them, so you needn't trouble." "Oh, you're laughing at me. I know you think I'm abominably vain, but I'm not. There really isn't one spark of vanity in me. And I'm never a bit grudging about paying compliments to other girls when they deserve them. I'm so glad I know you folks. I came up on Saturday, and I've nearly died of homesickness ever since. It's a horrible feeling, isn't it? In Bolingbroke I'm an important personage, and in Kingsport I'm just nobody. There were times when I could feel my soul turning a delicate blue. Where do you hang out?" 38 St. John Street. "Better and better. Why, I'm just round the corner on Wallace Street. I don't like my boarding house, though. It's bleak and lonesome, and my room looks out on such an unholy backyard. It's the ugliest place in the world. As for cats, well, surely all the Kingsport cats can't congregate there at night, but half of them must. I adore cats on hearth rugs, snoozing before nice friendly fires, but cats in backyards at midnight are totally different animals. The first night I was here I cried all night, and so did the cats. You should have seen my nose in the morning. How I wished I had never left home." "I don't know how you managed to make up your mind to come to Redmond at all, if you are really such an undecided person," said amused Priscilla. "Bless your heart, honey, I didn't. It was Father who wanted me to come here. His heart was set on it. Why, I don't know. It seems perfectly ridiculous to think of me studying for a B.A. degree, doesn't it? Not but what I can do it all right. I have heaps of brains." "Oh," said Priscilla vaguely. "Yes, but it's such hard work to use them. And B.A.'s are such learned, dignified, wise, solemn creatures. They must be. No, I didn't want to come to Redmond. I did it just to oblige Father. He is such a duck. Besides, I knew if I stayed home I'd have to get married. Mother wanted that, wanted it decidedly. Mother has plenty of decision. But I really hated the thought of being married for a few years yet. I wanted to have heaps of fun before I settled down. And ridiculous as the idea of my being a B.A. is, the idea of my being an old married woman is still more absurd, isn't it? I'm only 18. No, I concluded I would rather come to Redmond than be married. Besides, how could I ever have made up my mind which man to marry?" "Were there so many?" laughed Anne. "Heaps. The boys like me awfully, they really do. But there were only 2 that mattered. The rest were all too young and too poor. I must marry a rich man, you know." "Why must you?" "Honey, you couldn't imagine me being a poor man's wife, could you? I can't do a single useful thing, and I am very extravagant. Oh no, my husband must have heaps of money." So that narrowed them down to 2. But I couldn't decide between 2 any easier than between 200. I knew perfectly well that whichever one I chose I'd regret all my life that I hadn't married the other. "Didn't you love either of them?" asked Anne, a little hesitatingly. It was not easy for her to speak to a stranger of the great mystery and transformation of life. "Goodness, no. I couldn't love anybody. It isn't in me. Besides, I wouldn't want to. Being in love makes you a perfect slave, I think. And it would give a man such power to hurt you. I'd be afraid. No, no, Alec and Alonzo are 2 dear boys, and I like them both so much that I really don't know which I like the better. That is the trouble. Alec is the best looking, of course, and I simply couldn't marry a man who wasn't handsome. He is good-tempered, too, and has lovely curly black hair. He's rather too perfect. I don't believe I'd like a perfect husband, somebody I could never find fault with." "Then why not marry Alonzo?" asked Priscilla gravely. "Think of marrying a name like Alonzo," said Phil dolefully. "I don't believe I could endure it. But he has a classic nose, and it would be a comfort to have a nose in the family that could be depended on. I can't depend on mine. So far it takes after the Gordon pattern, but I'm so afraid it will develop Byron tendencies as I grow older. I examine it every day anxiously to make sure it's still Gordon. Mother was a Byron and has the Byron nose in the Byronest degree. Wait till you see it. I adore nice noses. Your nose is awfully nice, Anne Shirley. Alonzo's nose nearly turned the balance in his favor." "But Alonzo!" "No, I couldn't decide. If I could have done as I did with the hat, stood them both up together, shut my eyes, and jabbed with a hat pin, it would have been quite easy." "What did Alec and Alonzo feel like when you came away?" queried Priscilla. "Oh, they still have hope. I told them they'd have to wait till I could make up my mind. They're quite willing to wait. They both worship me, you know. Meanwhile, I intend to have a good time. I expect I shall have heaps of beaux at Redmond. I can't be happy unless I have, you know. But don't you think the freshmen are fearfully homey? I saw only one really handsome fellow among them. He went away before you came. I heard his chum call him Gilbert. His chum had eyes that stuck out that far. But you're not going yet, girls. Don't go yet." "I think we must," said Anne rather coldly. "It's getting late, and I have some work to do." "But you'll both come to see me, won't you?" asked Philippa, getting up and putting an arm around each. "And let me come to see you. I want to be chummy with you. I've taken such a fancy to you both. And I haven't quite disgusted you with my frivolity, have I?" "Not quite," laughed Anne, responding to Phil's squeeze with a return of cordiality. "Because I'm not half so silly as I seem on the surface, you know. You just accept Philippa Gordon as the Lord made her with all her faults, and I believe you'll come to like her. Isn't this graveyard a sweet place? I'd love to be buried here. Here's a grave I didn't see before. This one in the iron railing. Oh, girls, look, see! The stone says it's the grave of a middy who was killed in the fight between the Shannon and the Chesapeake. Just fancy!" Anne paused by the railing and looked at the worn stone, her pulses thrilling with sudden excitement. The old graveyard with its overarching trees and long aisles of shadows faded from her sight. Instead she saw the Kingsport harbor of nearly a century agone. Out of the mist came slowly a great frigate, brilliant with the meteor flag of England. Behind her was another, with a still heroic form wrapped in his own starry flag, lying on the quarter-deck, the gallant Lawrence. Time's finger had turned back his pages, and that was the Shannon sailing triumphant up the bay with the Chesapeake as her prize. "Come back, Anne Shirley, come back!" laughed Philippa, pulling her arm. "You're 100 years away from us. Come back!" Anne came back with a sigh. Her eyes were shining softly. "I've always loved that old story," she said, "and although the English won that victory, I think it was because of the brave defeated commander I love it. This grave seems to bring it so near and make it so real. This poor little middy was only 18. He died of desperate wounds received in gallant action. So reads his epitaph. It is such as a soldier might wish for." Before she turned away, Anne unpinned the little cluster of purple pansies she wore, and dropped it softly on the grave of the boy who had perished in the great sea duel. "Well, what do you think of our new friend?" asked Priscilla when Phil had left them. "I like her. There's something very lovable about her in spite of all her nonsense. I believe, as she says herself, that she isn't half as silly as she sounds. She's a dear, kissable baby, and I don't know that she'll ever really grow up." "I like her too," said Priscilla decidedly. "She talks as much about boys as Ruby Gillis does. But it always enrages or sickens me to hear Ruby, whereas I just wanted to laugh good-naturedly at Phil. Now what is the why of that?" "There is a difference," said Anne meditatively. "I think it's because Ruby is really so conscious of boys. She plays at love and love-making. Besides, you feel, when she is boasting of her beaux, that she is doing it to rub it well into you that you haven't half so many. Now, when Phil talks of her beaux, it sounds as if she was just speaking of chums. She really looks upon boys as good comrades, and she is pleased when she has dozens of them tagging around simply because she likes to be popular and to be thought popular. Even Alex and Alonzo, I'll never be able to think of those two names separately after this, are to her just two playfellows who want her to play with them all her lives. I'm glad when he met her, and I'm glad we went to old St. John's. I believe I've put forth a tiny soul root into Kingsport soil this afternoon. I hope so. I hate to feel transplanted. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Anne of the Island by Maud Montgomery. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sweet Pea. Chapter 5. Letters from Home. For the next 3 weeks Anne and Priscilla continued to feel as strangers in a strange land. Then, suddenly, everything seemed to fall into focus. Redmond, professors, classes, students, studies, social doings. Life became homogeneous again, instead of being made up of detached fragments. The freshmen, instead of being a collection of unrelated individuals, found themselves a class, with a class spirit, a class yell, class interests, class antipathies, and class ambitions. They won the day in the annual arts rush against the sophomores, and thereby gained the respect of all the classes, and an enormous confidence-giving opinion of themselves. For 3 years the sophomores had won in the rush. That the victory of this year perched upon the freshmen's banner was attributed to the strategic generalship of Gilbert Blythe, who marshalled the campaign and originated certain new tactics which demoralized the sophs and swept the freshmen to triumph. As a reward of merit he was elected president of the freshman class, a position of honor and responsibility, from a fresh point of view at least, coveted by many. He was also invited to join the Lambs, Redmondese for Lambda Theta, a compliment rarely paid to a freshman. As a preparatory initiation ordeal he had to parade the principal business streets of Kingsport for a whole day, wearing a sunbonnet and a voluminous kitchen apron of gaudily flowered calico. This he did cheerfully, doffing his sunbonnet with courtly grace when he met ladies of his acquaintance. Charlie Sloane, who had not been asked to join the Lambs, told Anne he did not see how Blythe could do it, and he, for his part, could never humiliate himself so. "Fancy Charlie Sloane in a caliker apron and a sunbonnet," giggled Priscilla. He'd look exactly like his old grandmother Sloane. Gilbert, now, looked as much like a man in them as in his own proper habiliments. Anne and Priscilla found themselves in the thick of the social life of Redmond. That this came about so speedily was due in great measure to Philippa Gordon. Philippa was the daughter of a rich and well-known man, and belonged to an old and exclusive Bluenose family. This, combined with her beauty and charm, a charm acknowledged by all who met her, promptly opened the gates of all cliques, clubs, and classes in Redmond to her, and where she went Anne and Priscilla went too. Phil adored Anne and Priscilla, especially Anne. She was a loyal little soul, crystal-free from any form of snobbishness. "Love me, love my friends," seemed to be her unconscious motto. Without effort she took them with her into her ever-widening circle of acquaintanceship, and the 2 Avonlea girls found their social pathway at Redmond made very easy and pleasant for them, to the envy and wonderment of the other freshettes, who, lacking Philippa's sponsorship, were doomed to remain rather on the fringe of things during their first college year. To Anne and Priscilla, with their more serious views of life, Phil remained the amusing, lovable baby she had seemed on their first meeting. Yet, as she said herself, she had "heaps of brains." When or where she found time to study was a mystery, for she seemed always in demand for some kind of fun, and her home evenings were crowded with callers. She had all the "beauks" that heart could desire, for 9/10ths of the freshmen, and a big fraction of all the other classes, were rivals for her smiles. She was naively delighted over this, and gleefully recounted each new conquest to Anne and Priscilla, with comments that might have made the unlucky lover's ears burn fiercely. "Alec and Alonzo don't seem to have any serious rival yet," remarked Anne teasingly. "Not one," agreed Philippa. "I write them both every week and tell them all about my young men here. I'm sure it must amuse them. But of course the one I like best I can't get. Gilbert Blythe won't take any notice of me, except to look at me as if I were a nice little kitten he'd like to pat. Too well I know the reason. I owe you a grudge, Queen Anne. I really ought to hate you, and instead I love you madly, and I'm miserable if I don't see you every day. You're different from any girl I ever knew before. When you look at me in a certain way I feel what an insignificant, frivolous little beast I am, and I long to be better and wiser and stronger. And then I make good resolutions, but the first nice-looking manny who comes my way knocks them all over my head. Isn't college life magnificent? It's so funny to think I hated it that first day. But if I hadn't, I might never have got really acquainted with you. Anne, please tell me over again that you like me a little bit. I yearn to hear it. I like you a big bit, and I think you're a dear, sweet, adorable, velvety, clawless little kitten, laughed Anne. But I don't see when you ever get time to learn your lessons. Phil must have found time, for she held her own in every class of her year. Even the grumpy old professor of mathematics, who detested codes, and had bitterly opposed their admission to Redmond, couldn't floor her. She led the freshettes everywhere, except in English, where Anne Shirley left her far behind. Anne herself found the studies of her freshman year very easy, thanks in great part to the steady work she and Gilbert had put in during those 2 past years in Avonlea. This left her more time for a social life which she thoroughly enjoyed. But never for a moment did she forget Avonlea, and her friends there. To her the happiest moments in each week were those in which letters came from home. It was not until she had got her first letters that she began to think she could ever like Kingsport or feel at home there. Before they came, Avonlea had seemed thousands of miles away. Those letters brought it near and linked the old life to the new so closely that they began to seem one and the same, instead of 2 hopelessly segregated existences. The first batch contained 6 letters, from Jane Andrews, Ruby Gillis, Diana Barry, Marilla, Mrs. Lynde, and Davy. Jane's was a copperplate production, with every T nicely crossed and every I precisely dotted, and not an interesting sentence in it. She never mentioned the school, concerning which Anne was avid to hear. She never answered one of the questions Anne had asked in her letter. But she told Anne how many yards of lace she had recently crocheted, and the kind of weather they were having in Avonlea, and how she intended to have her new dress made, and the way she felt when her head ached. Ruby Gillis wrote a gushing epistle, deploring Anne's absence, assuring her she was horribly missed in everything, asking what the Redmond fellows were like, and filling the rest with accounts of her own harrowing experiences with her numerous admirers. It was a silly, harmless letter, and Anne would have laughed over it had it not been for the postscript. "Gilbert seems to be enjoying Redmond, judging from his letters," wrote Ruby. "I don't think Charlie is so stuck on it." So Gilbert was writing to Ruby. Very well, he had a perfect right to, of course, only Anne did not know that Ruby had written the first letter and that Gilbert had answered it from mere courtesy. She tossed Ruby's letter aside contemptuously, but it took all Diana's breezy, newsy, delightful epistle to banish the sting of Ruby's postscript. Diana's letter contained a little too much Fred, but was otherwise crowded and crossed with items of interest, and Anne almost felt herself back in Avonlea while reading it. Marilla's was a rather prim and colorless epistle, severely innocent of gossip or emotion. Yet somehow it conveyed to Anne a whiff of the wholesome, simple life at Green Gables, with its savor of ancient peace and the steadfast abiding love that was there for her. Mrs. Lynde's letter was full of church news. Having broken up housekeeping, Mrs. Lynde had more time than ever to devote to church affairs, and had flung herself into them heart and soul. She was at present much worked up over the poor "supplies" they were having in the vacant Avonlea pulpit. "I don't believe any but fools enter the ministry nowadays," she wrote bitterly. "Such candidates as they have sent us, and such stuff as they preach! Half of it ain't true, and what's worse, it ain't sound doctrine. The one we have now is the worst of the lot. He mostly takes a text and preaches about something else. And he says he doesn't believe all the heathen will be eternally lost. The idea! If they won't, all the money we've been giving to foreign missions will be clean wasted, that's what. Last Sunday night he announced that next Sunday he'd preach on the axe head that swam. I think he'd better confine himself to the Bible and leave sensational subjects alone. Things have come to a pretty pass if a minister can't find enough in Holy Writ to preach about, that's what. What church do you attend, Anne? I hope you go regularly. People are apt to get so careless about church going away from home, and I understand college students are great sinners in this respect. I'm told many of them actually study their lessons on Sunday. I hope you'll never sink that low, Anne. Remember how you were brought up, and be very careful what friends you make. You never know what sort of creatures are in them colleges. Outwardly they may be as white as sepulchres, and inwardly as ravening wolves, that's what. You'd better not have anything to say to any young man who isn't from the island. I forgot to tell you what happened the day the minister called here. It was the funniest thing I ever saw. I said to Marilla, if Anne had been here, wouldn't she have had a laugh? Even Marilla laughed.
You know, he's a very short, fat little man with bow legs. Well, that old pig of Mr. Harrison's, the big tall one, had wandered over here that day again and broke into the yard, and had got into the back porch, unbeknownst to us, and it was there when the minister appeared in the doorway. It made one wild bolt to get out, but there was nowhere to bolt except between them bow legs. So there it went, and, being as it was so big and the minister so little, it took him clean off his feet and carried him away. His hat went one way and his cane another, just as Marilla and I got to the door. I'll never forget the look of him, and that poor pig was near scared to death. I'll never be able to read that account in the Bible of the swine that rushed madly down the steep place into the sea without seeing Mr. Harrison's pig careering down the hill with that minister. I guess the pig thought he had the old boy in his back instead of inside of him. I was thankful the twins weren't about. It wouldn't have been the right thing for them to have seen a minister in such an undignified predicament. Just before they got to the brook, the minister jumped or fell off. The pig rushed through the brook like mad, and up through the woods. Marilla and I run down and helped the minister get up and brush his coat. He wasn't hurt, but he was mad. He seemed to hold Marilla and I responsible for it all, though we told him the pig didn't belong to us and had been pestering us all summer. Besides, what did he come to the back door for? You'd never have caught Mr. Allen doing that. It'll be a long time before we get a man like Mr. Allen. But it's an ill wind that blows no good. We've never seen hoof or hair of that pig since, and it's my belief we never will. Things is pretty quiet in Avonlea. I don't find Green Gables as lonesome as I expected. I think I'll start another cotton warp quilt this winter. Mrs. Silas Sloane has a handsome new apple leaf pattern. When I feel that I must have some excitement, I read the murder trials in that Boston paper my niece sends me. I never used to do it, but they're real interesting. States must be an awful place. I hope you'll never go there, Anne. But the way girls roam over the earth now is something terrible. It always makes me think of Satan in the book of Job, going to and fro and walking up and down. I don't believe the Lord ever intended it.
That's what.
Davy's been pretty good since you went away. One day he was bad, and Marilla punished him by making him wear Dora's apron all day, and then he went and cut all Dora's aprons up. I spanked him for that, and then he went and chased my rooster to death. The McPhersons have moved down to my place. She's a great housekeeper and very particular. She's rooted all my June lilies up because she says they make a garden look so untidy. Thomas set them lilies out when we were married. Her husband seems a nice sort of man, but she can't get over being an old maid, that's what. Don't study too hard, and be sure and put your winter underclothes on as soon as the weather gets cool. Marilla worries a lot about you, but I tell her you've got a lot more sense than I ever thought you would have at one time, and that you'll be all right. Davy's letter plunged into a grievance at the start. Dear Anne, please write and tell Marilla not to tie me to the rail of the bridge when I go fishing. The boys make fun of me when she does. It's awful lonesome here without you, but great fun in school. Jane Andrews is crosser than you. I scared Mrs. Lynde with a jack-o'-lantern last night. She was awful mad, and she was mad 'cause I chased her old rooster round the old yard till he fell down dead. I didn't mean to make him fall down dead. What made him die, Anne, I want to know. Mrs. Lynde threw him into the pig pen. She might have sold him to Mr. Blair. Mr. Blair is giving 50 cents apiece for good dead roosters now. I heard Mrs. Lynde asking the minister to pray for her. What did she do that was so bad, Anne, I want to know. I've got a kite with a magnificent tail, Anne. Milty Boulter told me a great story in school yesterday. It is true. Old Joe Mosey and Leon were playing cards one night last week in the woods. The cards were on a stump, and a big black man bigger than the trees come along and grabbed the cards in the stump and disappeared with a noise like thunder. You'll bet they were scared. Milty says the black man was the old Harry. Was he, Anne, I want to know. Mr. Kimball over at Spencerville is very sick and will have to go to the hospital. Please excuse me while I ask Marilla if that's spelled right. Marilla says it's the asylum he has to go to, not the other place. He thinks he has a snake inside of him. What's it like to have a snake inside of you, Anne, I want to know. Mrs. Lawrence Bell is sick too. Mrs. Lynde says that all that is the matter with her is that she thinks too much about her insides. I wonder, said Anne as she folded up her letters, what Mrs. Lynde would think of Philippa. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Anne of the Island by Maud Montgomery. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sweet Pea. Chapter 6. In the Park. What are you going to do with yourselves today, girls? Asked Philippa, popping into Anne's room one Saturday afternoon. We are going for a walk in the park, answered Anne. I ought to stay in and finish my blouse, but I couldn't sew in a day like this. There's something in the air that gets into my blood and makes a sort of glory in my soul. My fingers would twitch and I'd sew a crooked seam. So it's ho for the park and the pines. Does "we" include anyone but yourself and Priscilla? Yes, it includes Gilbert and Charlie, and we'll be very glad if it will include you also. But, said Philippa dolefully, if I go I'll have to be Gooseberry, and that will be a new experience for Philippa Gordon. Well, new experiences are broadening. Come along and you'll be able to sympathize with all poor souls who have to play Gooseberry often. But where are all the victims? Oh, I was tired of them all and simply couldn't be bothered with any of them today. Besides, I've been feeling a little blue, just a pale, elusive azure. It isn't serious enough for anything darker. I wrote Alec and Alonzo last week. I put the letters into envelopes and addressed them, but I didn't seal them up. That evening something funny happened. That is, Alec would think it funny, but Alonzo wouldn't be likely to. I was in a hurry, so I snatched Alec's letter, as I thought, out of the envelope and scribbled down a postscript. Then I mailed both letters. I got Alonzo's reply this morning. Girls, I had put that postscript to his letter, and he was furious. Of course, he'll get over it, and I don't care if he doesn't, but it spoiled my day. So I thought I'd come to you, darlings, to get cheered up. After the football season opens, I won't have any spare Saturday afternoons. I adore football. I've got the most gorgeous cap and sweater striped in Redmond colors to wear to the games. To be sure, a little way off I'll look like a walking barber's pole. Do you know that Gilbert of yours has been elected captain of the freshman football team? Yes, he told us so last evening, said Priscilla, seeing that outraged Anne would not answer. He and Charlie were down. We knew they were coming, so we painstakingly put out of sight or out of reach all Miss Ada's cushions. That very elaborate one with the raised embroidery I dropped on the floor in the corner behind the chair it was on. I thought it would be safe there. But would you believe it? Charlie Sloane made for that chair, noticed the cushion behind it, solemnly fished it up, and sat on it the whole evening. Such a wreck of a cushion it was. Poor Miss Ada asked me to-day, still smiling, but oh so reproachfully, why I had allowed it to be sat upon. I told her I hadn't, that it was a matter of predestination coupled with inveterate sloanishness, and I wasn't a match for both combined. Miss Ada's cushions are really getting on my nerves, said Anne. She finished 2 new ones last week, stuffed and embroidered within an inch of their lives. There being absolutely no other cushionless place to put them, she stood them up against the wall on the stair landing. They topple over half the time, and if we come up or down the stairs in the dark we fall over them. Last Sunday, when Dr. Davis prayed for all those exposed to the perils of the sea, I added in thought, and for all those who live in houses where cushions are loved not wisely but too well. There, we're ready, and I see the boys coming through old St. John's. Do you cast in your lot with us, Phil? I'll go, if I can walk with Priscilla and Charlie. That will be a bearable degree of gooseberry. That Gilbert of yours is a darling, Anne. But why does he go around so much with goggle eyes? Anne stiffened. She had no great liking for Charlie Sloane, but he was of Avonlea, so no outsider had any business to laugh at him. Charlie and Gilbert have always been friends, she said coldly. Charlie is a nice boy. He's not to blame for his eyes. Don't tell me that. He is. He must have done something dreadful in a previous existence to be punished with such eyes. Pris and I are going to have such sport with him this afternoon. We'll make fun of him to his face, and he'll never know it. Doubtless the abandoned peas, as Anne called them, did carry out their amiable intentions. But Sloane was blissfully ignorant. He thought he was quite a fine fellow to be walking with 2 such codes, especially Philippa Gordon, the class beauty and belle. It must surely impress Anne. She would see that some people appreciated him at his real value. Gilbert and Anne loitered a little behind the others, enjoying the calm, still beauty of the autumn afternoon, under the pines of the park, on the road that climbed and twisted round the harbor shore. The silence here is like a prayer, isn't it? Said Anne, her face upturned to the shining sky. How I love the pines! They seem to strike their roots deep into the romance of all the ages. It is so comforting to creep away now and then for a good talk with them. I always feel so happy out here. And so in mountain solitudes o'ertaken, as by some spell divine, their cares drop from them like the needles shaken from out the gusty pine, quoted Gilbert. They make our little ambitions seem rather petty, don't they, Anne? I think if ever any great sorrow came to me, I would come to the pines for comfort, said Anne dreamily. I hope no great sorrow ever will have come to you, Anne, said Gilbert, who could not connect the idea of sorrow with the vivid, joyous creature beside him, unwitting that those who can soar to the highest heights can also plunge to the deepest depths, and that the natures which enjoy most keenly are those which also suffer most sharply. "But there must some time," mused Anne. "Life seems like a cup of glory held to my lips just now. But there must be some bitterness in it. There is in every cup. I shall taste mine some day. Well, I hope I shall be strong and brave to meet it. And I hope it won't be through my own fault that it will come. Do you remember what Dr. Davis said last Sunday evening? That the sorrows God sent us brought comfort and strength with them, while the sorrows we brought on ourselves through folly or wickedness were by far the hardest to bear? But we mustn't talk of sorrow on an afternoon like this. It's meant for the sheer joy of living, isn't it?" "If I had my way I'd shut everything out of your life but happiness and pleasure, Anne," said Gilbert, in the tone that meant danger ahead. "Then you would be very unwise," rejoined Anne hastily. "I'm sure no life can be properly developed and rounded out without some trial and sorrow, though I suppose it is only when we are pretty comfortable that we admit it. Come, the others have got to the pavilion and are beckoning to us." They all sat down in the little pavilion to watch an autumn sunset of deep red fire and pallid gold. To their left lay Kingsport, its roofs and spires dim in their shroud of violet smoke. To the right lay the harbor, taking on tints of rose and copper as it stretched out into the sunset. Before them the water shimmered satin smooth and silver gray, and beyond, clean-shaven William's Island loomed out of the mist, guarding the town like a sturdy bulldog. Its lighthouse beacon flared through the mist like a baleful star, and was answered by another in the far horizon. "Did you ever see such a strong-looking place?" asked Philippa. "I don't want William's Island especially, but I'm sure I couldn't get it if I did. Look at that sentry on the summit of the fort right beside the flag. Doesn't he look as if he had stepped out of romance?" "Speaking of romance," said Priscilla, "we've been looking for heather, but of course we couldn't find any. It's too late in the season, I suppose." "Heather!" exclaimed Anne. "Heather doesn't grow in America, does it?" "There are just 2 patches of it in the whole continent," said Phil. "One right here in the park, and one somewhere else in Nova Scotia. I forget where. The famous Highland regiment, the Black Watch, camped here one year, and when the men shook out the straw of their beds in the spring, some seeds of heather took root." "Oh, how delightful!" said enchanted Anne. "Let's go home around by Spofford Avenue," suggested Gilbert. "We can see all the handsome houses where the wealthy nobles dwell. Spofford Avenue is the finest residential street in Kingsport. Nobody can build on it unless he's a millionaire." "Oh, do," said Phil. "There's a perfectly killing little place I want to show you, Anne. It wasn't built by a millionaire. It's the first place after you leave the park, and must have grown while Spofford Avenue was still a country road. It did grow. It wasn't built. I don't care for the houses on the avenue. They're too brand new and plate glassy. But this little spot is a dream, and its name, but wait till you see it." They sighed as they walked up the pine-fringed hill from the park. Just on the crest where Spofford Avenue petered out into a plain road was a little white frame house with groups of pines on either side of it, stretching their arms protectingly over its low roof. It was covered with red and gold vines, through which its green shuttered windows peeped. Before it was a tiny garden, surrounded by a low stone wall. October though it was, the garden was still very sweet, with dear old-fashioned unworldly flowers and shrubs, sweet May, southernwood, lemon verbena, alyssum, petunias, marigolds, and chrysanthemums. A tiny brick wall in herringbone pattern led from the gate to the front porch. The whole place might have been transplanted from some remote country village, yet there was something about it that made its nearest neighbor, the big lawn-encircled palace of a tobacco king, look exceedingly crude and showy and ill-bred by contrast. As Phil said, it was the difference between being born and being made. "It's the dearest place I ever saw," said Anne delightedly. "It gives me one of my old delightful funny aches. It's dearer and quainter than even Miss Lavendar's stone house." "It's the name I want you to notice especially," said Phil. "Look, in white letters around the archway over the gate. Patty's Place. Isn't that killing? Especially on this avenue of pinehursts and emeralds and cedar crofts. Patty's Place, if you please. I adore it." "Have you any idea who Patty is?" asked Priscilla. "Patty Spofford is the name of the old lady who owns it, I've discovered. She lives there with her niece, and they've lived there for hundreds of years, more or less. Maybe a little less, Anne. Exaggeration is merely a flight of poetic fancy. I understand that wealthy folk have tried to buy the lot time and again. It's really worth a small fortune now, you know.
but Patty won't sell upon any consideration. And there's an apple orchard behind the house in place of a backyard. You'll see it when we get a little past. A real apple orchard on Spofford Avenue. I'm going to dream about Patty's place tonight, said Anne. Why, I feel as if I belonged to it. I wonder if by any chance we'll ever see the inside of it. It isn't likely, said Priscilla. Anne smiled mysteriously. No, it isn't likely, but I believe it will happen. I have a queer, creepy-crawly feeling, you can call it a presentiment if you like, that Patty's Place and I are going to be better acquainted yet. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Anne of the Island. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sweet Pea. Chapter 7. Home Again. Those first 3 weeks at Redmond had seemed long, but the rest of the term flew by on wings of wind. Before they realized it, the Redmond students found themselves in the grind of Christmas examinations, emerging therefrom more or less triumphantly. The honor of leading in the freshman classes fluctuated between Anne, Gilbert, and Philippa. Priscilla did very well. Charlie Sloane scraped through respectably, and comported himself as complacently as if he had led in everything. I can't really believe that this time tomorrow I'll be in Green Gables, said Anne, on the night before departure. But I shall be. And you, Phil, will be in Bolingbroke with Alec and Alonzo. I'm longing to see them, admitted Phil, between the chocolate she was nibbling. They really are such dear boys, you know. There's to be no end of dances and drives and general jamborees. I shall never forgive you, Queen Anne, for not coming home with me for the holidays. Never means 3 days with you, Phil. It was dear of you to ask me, and I'd love to go to Bolingbroke some day. But I can't go this year. I must go home. You don't know how my heart longs for it. You won't have much of a time, said Phil scornfully. There'll be 1 or 2 quilting parties, I suppose, and all the old gossips will talk to you over your face and behind your back. You'll die of lonesomeness, child. In Avonlea, said Anne, highly amused. Now, if you'd come with me, you'd have a perfectly gorgeous time. Bolingbroke would go wild over you, Queen Anne, your hair and your style and, oh, everything. You're so different. You'd be such a success, and I would bask in reflected glory, not the rose, but near the rose. Do come after all, Anne. Your picture of social triumphs is quite fascinating, Phil, but I'll paint one to offset it. I'm going home to an old country farmhouse, once green, rather faded now, set among leafless apple orchards. There is a brook below and a December fir wood beyond, where I've heard harps swept by the fingers of rain and wind. There is a pond near by that will be gray and brooding now. There will be 2 oldish ladies in the house, one tall and thin, one short and fat, and there will be 2 twins, one a perfect model, the other what Mrs. Lynde calls a holy terror. There will be a little room upstairs over the porch, where old dreams hang thick, and a big, fat, glorious feather bed, which will almost seem the height of luxury after a boarding-house mattress. How do you like my picture, Phil? It seems a very dull one, said Phil, with a grimace. Oh, but I've left out the transforming thing, said Anne softly. There'll be love there, Phil. Faithful and tender love, such as I'll never find anywhere else in the world. Love that's waiting for me. That makes my picture a masterpiece, doesn't it, even if the colors are not very brilliant? Phil silently got up, tossed her box of chocolates away, went up to Anne, and put her arms around her. Anne, I wish I was like you, she said soberly. Diana met Anne at the Carmody station the next night, and they drove home together under silent, star-sown depths of sky. Green Gables had a very festal appearance as they drove up the lane. There was a light in every window, the glow breaking out through the darkness like flame-red blossoms swung against the dark background of the haunted wood. And in the yard was a brave bonfire with 2 gay little figures dancing around it, one of which gave an unearthly yell as the buggy turned in under the poplars. Davy means that for an Indian war whoop, said Diana. Mr. Harrison's hired boy taught it to him, and he's been practicing it up to welcome you with. Mrs. Lynde says it has worn her nerves to a frazzle. He creeps up behind her, you know, and then lets go. He was determined to have a bonfire for you, too. He's been piling up branches for a fortnight and pestering Marilla to be let pour some kerosene oil over it before setting it on fire.
I guess she did by the smell, though Mrs. Lynde said up to the last that Davy would blow himself and everybody else up if he was let. Anne was out of the buggy by this time, and Davy was rapturously hugging her knees, while even Dora was clinging to her hand.
Isn't that a bully bonfire, Anne? Just let me show you how to poke it. See the sparks? I did it for you, Anne, 'cause I was so glad you were coming home.
The kitchen door opened, and Marilla's spare form darkened against the inner light. She preferred to meet Anne in the shadows, for she was horribly afraid that she was going to cry with joy. She, stern, repressed Marilla, who thought all display of deep emotion unseemly. Mrs. Lynde was behind her, sonsy, kindly, matronly as of yore. The love that Anne had told Phil was waiting for her surrounded her and enfolded her with its blessing and its sweetness. Nothing, after all, could compare with old ties, old friends, and old Green Gables. How starry Anne's eyes were as they sat down to the loaded supper table, how pink her cheeks, how silver clear her laughter. And Diana was going to stay all night too. How like the dear old times it was! And the rosebud tea set graced the table. With Marilla the force of nature could no further go. "I suppose you and Diana will now proceed to talk all night," said Marilla sarcastically as the girls went upstairs. Marilla was always sarcastic after any self-betrayal.
Yes, agreed Anne gaily, but I'm going to put Davy to bed first. He insists on that.
"You bet," said Davy as they went along the hall.
I want somebody to say my prayers to again. It's no fun saying them alone.
"You don't say them alone, Davy. God is always with you to hear you."
Well, I can't see him, objected Davy. I want to pray to somebody I can see, but I won't say them to Mrs. Lynde or Marilla. There now.
Nevertheless, when Davy was garbed in his gray flannel nightie, he did not seem in a hurry to begin. He stood before Anne, shuffling one bare foot over the other, and looked undecided. "Come, dear, kneel down," said Anne. Davy came and buried his head in Anne's lap, but he did not kneel down.
"Anne," he said in a muffled voice, "I don't feel like praying after all. I haven't felt like it for a week now. I didn't pray last night nor the night before."
"Why not, Davy?" asked Anne gently.
You won't be mad if I tell you?" implored Davy.
Anne lifted the little gray flannelled body on her knee and cuddled his head on her arm. "Do I ever get mad when you tell me things, Davy?"
"No, you never do. But you get sorry, and that's worse. You'll be awful sorry when I tell you this, Anne, and you'll be ashamed of me, I suppose."
"Have you done something naughty, Davy, and is that why you can't say your prayers?"
"No, I haven't done anything naughty yet, but I want to do it."
"What is it, Davy?"
I want to say a bad word," Anne blurted out Davy with a desperate effort. "I heard Mr. Harrison's hired boy say it one day last week, and ever since I've been wanting to say it all the time, even when I'm saying my prayers."
"Say it then, Davy."
Davy lifted his flushed face in amazement. "But, Anne, it's an awful bad word."
"Say it." Davy gave her another incredulous look, then in a low voice he said the dreadful word. The next minute his face was burrowing against her.
"Oh, Anne, I'll never say it again, never. I'll never want to say it again. I knew it was bad, but I didn't suppose it was I didn't suppose it was like that."
"No, I don't think you'll ever want to say it again, Davy, or think it either. And I wouldn't go about much with Mr. Harrison's hired boy if I were you."
"He can make bully war whoops," said Davy a little regretfully.
"But you don't want your mind filled with bad words, do you, Davy? Words that will poison it and drive out all that is good and manly?"
"No," said Davy,
owl-eyed with introspection. "Then don't go with those people who use them. And now do you feel as if you could say your prayers, Davy?"
"Oh, yes," said Davy, eagerly wriggling down on his knees. "I can say them now all right. I ain't scared now to say if I should die before I wake, like I was when I was wanting to say that word." Probably Anne and Diana did empty out their souls to each other that night, but no record of their confidences has been preserved. They both looked as fresh and bright-eyed at breakfast as only youth can look, after unlawful hours of revelry and confession. There had been no snow up to this time, but as Diana crossed the old log bridge on her homeward way, the white flakes were beginning to flutter down over the fields and woods, russet and gray in their dreamless sleep. Soon the far-away slopes and hills were dim and wraith-like through their gauzy scarfing, as if a pale autumn had flung a misty bridal veil over her hair and was waiting for her wintry bridegroom. So they had a white Christmas after all, and a very pleasant day it was.
In the forenoon letters and gifts came from Miss Lavendar and Paul. Anne opened them in the cheerful Green Gables kitchen, which was filled with Davy sniffing an ecstasy called Pretty Smells. "Miss Lavendar and Mr. Irving are settled in their new home now," reported Anne. "I am sure Miss Lavendar is perfectly happy. I know it by the general tone of her letter, but there's a note from Charlotta the Fourth. She doesn't like Boston at all, and she is fearfully homesick. Miss Lavendar wants me to go through to Echo Lodge some day when I'm at home, and light a fire to air it, and see that the cushions aren't getting moldy. I think I'll get Diana to go over with me next week, and we can spend the evening with Theodora Dix. I want to see Theodora. By the way, is Ludovic Speed still going to see her?" "They say so," said Marilla, "and he's likely to continue it. Folks have given up expecting that courtship will ever arrive anywhere." "I'd hurry him up a bit if I was Theodora, that's what," said Mrs. Lynde. And there is not the slightest doubt but that she would. There was also a characteristic scrawl from Philippa, full of Alec and Alonzo, what they said and what they did, and how they looked when they saw her. "But I can't make up my mind yet which to marry," wrote Phil. "I do wish you had come with me to decide for me. Someone will have to. When I saw Alec my heart gave a great thump, and I thought he might be the right one. And then when Alonzo came, thump went my heart again. So that's no guide, though it should be according to all the novels I've ever read. Now, Anne, your thump wouldn't thump for anybody but the genuine Prince Charming, would it? There must be something radically wrong with me. But I'm having a perfectly gorgeous time. How I wish you were here. It's snowing today, and I'm rapturous. I was so afraid we'd have a green Christmas, and I loathe them. You know, when Christmas is a dirty, grey, browny affair, looking as if it had been left over 100 years ago and had been in soaks ever since, it is called a green Christmas. Don't ask me why. As Lord Dundreary says, there are some things no fellow can understand. And did you ever get on a streetcar and then discover that you hadn't any money with you to pay your fare? I did the other day. It's quite awful. I had a nickel with me when I got on the car. I thought it was in the left pocket of my coat. When I got settled down comfortably, I felt for it. It wasn't there. I had a cold chill. I felt in the other pocket. Not there. I had another chill. Then I felt in a little inside pocket. All in vain. I had 2 chills at once. I took off my gloves, laid them on the seat, and went over all my pockets again. It was not there. I stood up and shook myself, and then looked on the floor. The car was full of people who were going home from the opera, and they all stared at me. But I was past caring for a little thing like that. But I could not find my fare. I concluded I must have put it in my mouth and swallowed it inadvertently. I didn't know what to do. Would the conductor, I wondered, stop the car and put me off in ignominy and shame? Was it possible that I could convince him that I was merely the victim of my own absent-mindedness, and not an unprincipled creature trying to obtain a ride upon false pretenses? How I wished that Alec or Alonzo were there, but they weren't because I wanted them. If I hadn't wanted them, they would have been there by the dozen. And I couldn't decide what to say to the conductor when he came around. As soon as I got one sentence of explanation mapped out in my mind, I felt nobody could believe it, and I must compose another. It seemed there was nothing to do but trust in Providence, and for all the comfort that gave me, I might as well have been the old lady who, when told by the captain during a storm that she must put her trust in the Almighty, exclaimed, "Oh, Captain, is it as bad as that?" Just at the conventional moment, when all hope had fled, and the conductor was holding out his box to the passenger next to me, I suddenly remembered where I had put that wretched coin of the realm. I hadn't swallowed it after all. I meekly fished it out of the index finger of my glove and poked it in the box. I smiled at everybody, and felt that it was a beautiful world. The visit to Echo Lodge was not the least pleasant of many pleasant holiday outings. Anne and Diana went back to it by the old way of the beech woods, carrying a lunch basket with them. Echo Lodge, which had been closed ever since Miss Lavendar's wedding, was briefly thrown open to wind and sunshine once more, and firelight glimmered again in the little rooms. The perfume of Miss Lavendar's rose bowl still filled the air. It was hardly possible to believe that Miss Lavendar would not come tripping in presently with her brown eyes a-star with welcome, and that Charlotta the Fourth, blue of bow and wide of smile, would not pop through the door. Paul, too, seemed hovering around with his fairy fancies. "It really makes me feel a little bit like a ghost revisiting the old-time glimpses of the moon," laughed Anne. "Let's go out and see if the Echoes are at home. Bring the old horn. It is still behind the kitchen door." The Echoes were at home, over the white river, as silver clear and multitudinous as ever. and when they had ceased to answer, the girls locked up the lodge again and went away in the perfect half-hour that follows the rose and saffron of a winter sunset. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sweet Pea. Chapter 8. Anne's First Proposal. The old year did not slip away in a green twilight with a pinky yellow sunset. Instead, it went out with a wild white bluster and blow. It was one of the nights when the storm wind hurtles over the frozen meadows and black hollows, and moans around the eaves like a lost creature, and drives the snow sharply against the shaking panes. "Just the sort of night people like to cuddle down between their blankets and count their mercies," said Anne to Jane Andrews, who had come up to spend the afternoon and stay all night. But when they were cuddled between their blankets, in Anne's little porch room, it was not her mercies of which Jane was thinking. "Anne," she said very solemnly, "I want to tell you something. May I?" Anne was feeling rather sleepy after the party Ruby Gillis had given the night before. She would much rather have gone to sleep than listen to Jane's confidences, which she was sure would bore her. She had no prophetic inkling of what was coming. Probably Jane was engaged too. Rumor averred that Ruby Gillis was engaged to the Spencervale school teacher, about whom all the girls were said to be quite wild. "I'll soon be the only fancy-free maiden of our old quartet," thought Anne drowsily. Aloud she said, "Of course." "Anne," said Jane still more solemnly, "what do you think of my brother Billy?" Anne gasped over this unexpected question, and floundered helplessly in her thoughts. Goodness, what did she think of Billy Andrews? She had never thought anything about him. Round-faced, stupid, perpetually smiling, good-natured Billy Andrews. Did anybody ever think about Billy Andrews? I don't understand, Jane," she stammered. "What do you mean exactly?" "Do you like Billy?" asked Jane bluntly. Why, yes, I like him, of course," gasped Anne, wondering if she were telling the literal truth. Certainly she did not dislike Billy, but could the indifferent tolerance with which she regarded him, when he happened to be in her range of vision, be considered positive enough for liking? What was Jane trying to elucidate? "Would you like him for a husband?" asked Jane calmly. A husband! Anne had been sitting up in bed the better to wrestle with the problem of her exact opinion of Billy Andrews. Now she fell flatly back on her pillows, the very breath gone out of her. "Whose husband?" "Yours, of course," answered Jane. "Billy wants to marry you. He has always been crazy about you, and now father has given him the upper farm in his own name, and there's nothing to prevent him from getting married. But he's so shy he couldn't ask you himself if you'd have him, so he got me to do it. I'd rather not have, but he gave me no peace till I said I would, if I got a good chance. What do you think about it, Anne? Was it a dream? Was it one of those nightmare things in which you find yourself engaged or married to someone you hate or don't know, without the slightest idea how it ever came about?" No, she, Anne Shirley, was lying there wide awake in her own bed, and Jane Andrews was beside her, calmly proposing for her brother Billy. Anne did not know whether she wanted to writhe or laugh, but she could do neither, for Jane's feelings must not be hurt. I couldn't marry Billy, you know, Jane," she managed to gasp. "Why, such an idea never occurred to me. Never." "I don't suppose it did," agreed Jane. "Billy has always been far too shy to think of courting. But you might think it over, Anne. Billy is a good fellow. I must say that, even if he is my brother. He has no bad habits, and he's a great worker, and you can depend on him. A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. He told me to tell you he'd be quite willing to wait till you got through college if you insisted, though he'd rather get married this spring before the planting begins. He'd always be very good to you, I'm sure, and you know, Anne, I'd love to have you for a sister." "I can't marry Billy," said Anne decidedly. She had recovered her wits, and was even feeling a little angry. It was all so ridiculous. "There is no use thinking of it, Jane. I don't care anything for him in that way, and you must tell him so." "Well, I didn't suppose you would," said Jane with a resigned sigh, feeling that she had done her best. "I told Billy I didn't believe it was a bit of use to ask you, but he insisted. Well, you've made your decision, Anne, and I hope you won't regret it." Jane spoke rather coldly. She had been perfectly sure that the enamored Billy had no chance at all of inducing Anne to marry him. Nevertheless, she felt a little resentment that Anne Shirley, who was, after all, merely an adopted orphan, without kith or kin, should refuse her brother, one of the Avonlea Andrews. Well, pride sometimes goes before a fall, Jane reflected ominously. Anne permitted herself to smile in the darkness over the idea that she might ever regret not marrying Billy Andrews.
"I hope Billy won't feel very badly over it," she said nicely. Jane made a movement as if she were tossing her head on her pillow.
"Oh, he won't break his heart. Billy has too much good sense for that. He likes Nettie Blewett pretty well, too, and Mother would rather he married her than anyone. She's such a good manager and saver, I think. When Billy is once sure you won't have him, he'll take Nettie. Please don't mention this to anyone, will you, Anne?" "Certainly not," said Anne, who had no desire whatever to publish abroad the fact that Billy Andrews wanted to marry her, preferring her, when all was said and done, to Nettie Blewett. Nettie Blewett! "And now I suppose we'd better go to sleep," suggested Jane. To sleep went Jane easily and speedily, but, though very unlike Macbeth in most respects, she had certainly contrived to murder sleep for Anne. That proposed to damsel lay on a wakeful pillow until the wee sma's, but her meditations were far from being romantic. It was not, however, until the next morning that she had an opportunity to indulge in a good laugh over the whole affair. When Jane had gone home, still with a hint of frost in her voice and manner, because Anne had declined so ungratefully and decidedly the honour of an alliance with the house of Andrews, Anne retreated to the porch room, shut the door, and had her laugh out at last. "If I could only share the joke with someone," she thought. "But I can't. Diana is the only one I'd want to tell, and, even if I hadn't sworn secrecy to Jane, I can't tell Diana things now. She tells everything to Fred, I know she does. Well, I've had my first proposal. I supposed it would come some day, but I certainly never thought it would be by proxy. It's awfully funny, and yet there's a sting in it too, somehow." Anne knew quite well wherein the sting consisted, though she did not put it into words. She had had her secret dreams the first time someone should ask her the great question. And it had in those dreams always been very romantic and beautiful, and the someone was to be very handsome and dark-eyed and distinguished-looking and eloquent, whether he were Prince Charming to be enraptured with yes, or one to whom a regretful, beautifully worded but hopeless refusal must be given. If the latter, the refusal was to be expressed so delicately that it would be next best thing to acceptance, and he would go away after kissing her hand, assuring her of his unalterable lifelong devotion. And it would always be a beautiful memory, to be proud of and a little sad about also. And now this thrilling experience had turned out to be merely grotesque. Billy Andrews had got his sister to propose for him because his father had given him the upper farm, and if Anne wouldn't have him, Nettie Blewett would. There was romance for you, with a vengeance. Anne laughed, and then sighed. The bloom had been brushed from one little maiden dream. Would the painful process go on until everything became prosaic and humdrum? End of chapter 8.
Chapter 9 of Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sweet Pea. Chapter 9. An Unwelcome Lover and a Welcome Friend. The second term at Redmond sped as quickly as had the first. Actually whizzed away, Philippa said. Anne enjoyed it thoroughly in all its phases, the stimulating class rivalry, the making and deepening of new and helpful friendships, the gay little social stunts, the doings of the various societies of which she was a member, the widening of horizons and interests. She studied hard, for she had made up her mind to win the Thorburn Scholarship in English. This being won, meant that she could come back to Redmond the next year without trenching on Marilla's small savings, something Anne was determined she would not do. Gilbert, too, was in full chase after a scholarship, but found plenty of time for frequent calls at 38 St. John's. He was Anne's escort at nearly all the college affairs, and she knew that their names were coupled in Redmond gossip. Anne raged over this, but was helpless. She could not cast an old friend like Gilbert aside, especially when he had grown suddenly wise and wary, as behoved him, in the dangerous proximity of more than one Redmond youth, who would gladly have taken his place by the side of the slender, red-haired Code, whose gray eyes were as alluring as stars of evening. Anne was never attended by the crowd of willing victims who hovered around Philippa's conquering march through her freshman year. But there was a lanky, brainy freshie, a jolly little round sophomore, and a tall, learned junior, who all liked to call at 38 St. John's, and talk over ologies and isms, as well as lighter subjects, with Anne, in the becushioned parlor of that domicile. Gilbert did not love any of them, and he was exceedingly careful to give none of them the advantage over him by any untimely display of his real feelings Anneward.
To her he had become again the boy comrade of Avonlea days, and as such could hold his own against any smitten swain who had so far entered the lists against him. As a companion, Anne honestly acknowledged nobody could be so satisfactory as Gilbert. She was very glad, so she told herself, that he had evidently dropped all nonsensical ideas, though she spent considerable time secretly wondering why. Only one disagreeable incident marred that winter. Charlie Sloane, sitting bolt upright on Miss Ada's most dearly beloved cushion, asked Anne one night if she would promise to become Mrs. Charlie Sloane some day. Coming after Billy Andrews' proxy effort, this was not quite the shock to Anne's romantic sensibilities that it would otherwise have been, but it was certainly another heart-rending disillusion. She was angry, too, for she felt that she had never given Charlie the slightest encouragement to suppose such a thing possible. But what could you expect of a Sloane, as Mrs. Rachel Lynde would ask scornfully? Charlie's whole attitude, tone, air, words, fairly reeked with Sloanishness. He was conferring a great honor, no doubt whatever about that. And when Anne, utterly insensible to the honor, refused him as delicately and considerately as she could, for even a Sloane had feelings which ought not to be unduly lacerated, Sloanishness still further betrayed itself. Charlie certainly did not take his dismissal as Anne's imaginary rejected suitors did. Instead, he became angry, and showed it. He said 2 or 3 quite nasty things. Anne's temper flashed up mutinously, and she retorted with a cutting little speech, whose keenness pierced even Charlie's protective Sloanishness and reached the quick. He caught up his hat and flung himself out of the house with a very red face. Anne rushed upstairs, falling twice over Miss Ada's cushions on the way, and threw herself onto her bed in tears of humiliation and rage. Had she actually stooped to quarrel with a Sloane? Was it possible anything Charlie Sloane could say had power to make her angry? Oh, this was degradation indeed, worse even than being the rival of Nettie Blewett. "I wish I need never see the horrible creature again," she sobbed vindictively into her pillows. She could not avoid seeing him again, but the outraged Charlie took care that it should not be at very close quarters. Miss Ada's cushions were henceforth safe from his depredations, and when he met Anne on the street or in Redmond's halls, his bow was icy in the extreme. Relations between those 2 old schoolmates continued to be thus strained for nearly a year. Then Charlie transferred his blighted affections to a round, rosy, snub-nosed, blue-eyed little sophomore, who appreciated them as they deserved, whereupon he forgave Anne and condescended to be civil to her again, in a patronizing manner intended to show her just what she had lost. One day Anne scurried excitedly into Priscilla's room. "Read that!" she cried, tossing Priscilla a letter. "It's from Stella, and she's coming to Redmond next year, and what do you think of her idea? I think it's a perfectly splendid one if we can only carry it out. Do you suppose we can, Pris?" "I'll be better able to tell you when I find out what it is," said Priscilla, casting aside a Greek lexicon and taking up Stella's letter. Stella Maynard had been one of their chums at Queen's Academy, and had been teaching school ever since. "But I'm going to give it up, Anne dear," she wrote, "and go to college next year. As I took the 3rd year at Queen's, I can enter the sophomore year. I'm tired of teaching in a back country school. Some day I'm going to write a treatise on The Trials of a Country Schoolmarm. It will be a harrowing bit of realism. It seems to be the prevailing impression that we live in clover and have nothing to do but draw our quarter's salary. My treatise shall tell the truth about us. Why, if a week should pass without someone telling me that I am doing easy work for big pay, I would conclude that I might as well order my ascension robe immediately and to onct." "Well, you get your money easy, some ratepayer will tell me condescendingly. All you have to do is sit there and hear lessons. I used to argue the matter at first, but I'm wiser now. Facts are stubborn things, but as someone has wisely said, not half so stubborn as fallacies. So I only smile loftily now in eloquent silence. Why, I have 9 grades in my school, and I have to teach a little of everything from investigating the interiors of earthworms to the study of the solar system. My youngest pupil is 4. His mother sends him to school to get him out of the way, and my oldest 20. It suddenly struck him that it would be easier to go to school and get an education than follow the plow any longer. In the wild effort to cram all sorts of research into 6 hours a day, I don't wonder if the children feel like the little boy who was taken to see the biograph. "I have to look for what's coming next before I know what went last," he complained. I feel like that myself. And the letters I get, Anne! Tommy's mother writes me that Tommy is not coming on in arithmetic as fast as she would like. He is only in simple reduction yet, and yet Johnny Johnson is in fractions, and Johnny isn't half as smart as her Tommy, and she can't understand it. And Susie's father wants to know why Susie can't write a letter without misspelling half the words, and Dick's aunt wants me to change his seat because that bad brown boy he's sitting with is teaching him to say naughty words. As to the financial part, but I'll not begin on that. Those whom the gods wish to destroy, they first make country schoolmarms. There, I feel better after that growl. After all, I've enjoyed these past 2 years, but I'm coming to Redmond. And now, Anne, I have a little plan. You know how I loathe boarding. I've boarded for 4 years, and I'm so tired of it. I don't feel like enduring 3 years more of it. Now, why can't you and Priscilla and I club together, rent a little house somewhere in Kingsport, and board ourselves? It would be cheaper than any other way. Of course, we would have to have a housekeeper, and I have one ready on the spot. You've heard me speak of Aunt Jamesina? She's the sweetest aunt that ever lived, in spite of her name. She can't help that. She was called Jamesina because her father, his name was James, drowned at sea a month before she was born. I always call her Aunt Jimsy. Well, her only daughter has recently married and gone to the foreign mission field. Aunt Jamesina is left alone in a great big house, and she is horribly lonesome. She will come to Kingsport and keep house for us if we want her, and I know you'll both love her. The more I think of the plan, the more I like it. We could have such good independent times. Now, if you and Priscilla agree to it, wouldn't it be a good idea for you, who are on the spot, to look around and see if you can find a suitable house this spring? That would be better than leaving it till the fall. If you could get a furnished one, so much the better, but if not, we can scare up a few sticks of furniture between us and old family friends with attics. Anyhow, decide as soon as you can and write me, so that Aunt Jamesina will know what plans to make for next year. I think it's a good idea, said Priscilla. So do I, agreed Anne delightedly. Of course, we have a nice boarding house here, but when all's said and done, a boarding house isn't home. So let's go house hunting at once, before exams come on. I am afraid it will be hard enough to get a really suitable house, warned Priscilla. Don't expect too much, Anne. Nice houses in nice localities will probably be away beyond our means. We'll likely have to content ourselves with a shabby little place on some street whereon to live people whom to know is to be unknown, and make life inside compensate for the outside. Accordingly they went house hunting, but to find just what they wanted proved even harder than Priscilla had feared. Houses there were galore, furnished and unfurnished, but one was too big, another too small, this one too expensive, that one too far from Redmond. Exams were on and over. The last week of the term came, and still their house of dreams, as Anne called it, remained a castle in the air. We shall have to give up and wait till the fall, I suppose, said Priscilla wearily, as they rambled through the park on one of April's darling days of breeze and blue, when the harbour was creaming and shimmering beneath the pearl-hued mists floating over it. We may find some shack to shelter us then, and if not, boarding houses we shall have always with us. I'm not going to worry about it just now, anyway, and spoil this lovely afternoon, said Anne, gazing around her with delight. The fresh, chill air was faintly charged with the aroma of pine balsam, and the sky above was crystal clear and blue, a great inverted cup of blessing. Spring is singing in my blood today, and the lure of April is abroad on the air. I'm seeing visions and dreaming dreams, Pris. That's because the wind is from the west. I do love the west wind. It sings of hope and gladness, doesn't it? When the east wind blows, I always think of sorrowful rain on the eaves and sad waves on a grey shore. When I get old, I shall have rheumatism when the wind is east. And isn't it jolly when you discard furs and winter garments for the first time, and sally forth like this in spring attire? Laughed Priscilla. Don't you feel as if you've been made over new? Everything is new in the spring, said Anne. Springs themselves are always so new, too. No spring is ever just like any other spring. It always has something of its own to be its own particular sweetness. See how green the grass is around that little pond, and how the willow buds are bursting. And exams are over and gone. The time of convocation will come soon, next Wednesday. This day week will be home. I'm glad, said Anne dreamily. There are so many things I want to do. I want to sit on the back porch steps and feel the breeze blowing down over Mr. Harrison's fields. I want to hunt ferns in the haunted wood and gather violets in Violet Vale. Do you remember the day of our golden picnic, Priscilla? I want to hear the frogs singing and the poplars whispering. But I've learned to love Kingsport too, and I'm glad I'm coming back next fall. If I hadn't won the Thorburn, I don't believe I could have. I couldn't take any of Marilla's little hoard. If we could only find a house, sighed Priscilla. Look over there at Kingsport, Anne. Houses, houses everywhere, and not one for us."
"Stop it, Pris. The best is yet to be. Like the old Roman, we'll find a house or build one. On a day like this there's no such word as fail in my bright lexicon." They lingered in the park until sunset, living in the amazing miracle and glory and wonder of the springtide, and they went home as usual by way of Spofford Avenue, that they might have the delight of looking at Patty's Place. "I feel as if something mysterious were going to happen right away by the pricking of my thumbs," said Anne, as they went up to the slope. "It's a nice story bookish feeling. Why, Priscilla Grant! Look over there and tell me if it's true, or am I seeing things?"
Priscilla looked. Anne's thumbs and eyes had not deceived her. Over the arched gateway of Patty's Place dangled the little modest sign. It said, "To let, furnished. Inquire within."
"Priscilla," said Anne in a whisper, "do you suppose it's possible that we could rent Patty's Place?" "No, I don't," averred Priscilla. "It would be too good to be true. Fairy tales don't happen nowadays. I won't hope, Anne. The disappointment would be too awful to bear. They're sure to want more for it than we can afford. Remember, it's on Spofford Avenue." "We must find out anyhow," said Anne resolutely. "It's too late to call this evening, but we'll come tomorrow. Oh, Pris, if we can get this darling spot! I've always felt that my fortunes were linked with Patty's Place ever since I saw it first."
End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sweet Pea. Chapter 10. Patty's Place. The next evening found them treading resolutely the herringbone walk through the tiny garden. The April wind was filling the pine trees with its roundelay, and the grove was alive with robins, great plump saucy fellows strutting along the paths. The girls rang rather timidly, and were admitted by a grim and ancient handmaiden. The door opened directly into a large living room, where by a cheery little fire sat two other ladies, both of whom were also grim and ancient. Except that one looked to be about 70 and the other 50, there seemed little difference between them. Each had amazingly big light blue eyes behind steel-rimmed spectacles, each wore a cap and a gray shawl, each was knitting without haste and without rest. Each rocked placidly and looked at the girls without speaking, and just behind each sat a large white china dog, with round green spots all over it, a green nose, and green ears. Those dogs captured Anne's fancy on the spot. They seemed like the twin guardian deities of Patty's Place. For a few minutes nobody spoke. The girls were too nervous to find words, and neither the ancient ladies nor the china dogs seemed conversationally inclined. Anne glanced about the room. What a dear place it was! Another door opened out of it directly into the pine grove, and the robins came boldly up on the very step. The floor was spotted with round braided mats such as Marilla made at Green Gables, but which were considered out of date everywhere else, even in Avonlea. And yet here they were on Spofford Avenue. A big polished grandfather's clock ticked loudly and solemnly in a corner. There were delightful little cupboards over the mantelpiece, behind whose glass doors gleamed quaint bits of china. The walls were hung with old prints and silhouettes. In one corner the stairs went up, and at the first low turn was a long window with an inviting seat. It was all just as Anne had known it must be. By this time the silence had grown too dreadful, and Priscilla nudged Anne to intimate that she must speak.
We saw by your sign that this house is to let," said Anne faintly, addressing the older lady, who was evidently Miss Patty Spofford. "Oh, yes," said Miss Patty. "I intended to take that sign down today." "Then we are too late," said Anne sorrowfully. "You've let it to someone else?" "No, but we have decided not to let it at all." "Oh, I'm so sorry!" exclaimed Anne impulsively. "I love this place so. I did hope we could have got it." Then did Miss Patty lay down her knitting, take off her specs, rub them, put them on again, and for the first time look at Anne as at a human being. The other lady followed her example so perfectly that she might as well have been a reflection in a mirror. "You love it," said Miss Patty with emphasis. "Does that mean that you really love it, or that you merely like the looks of it?"
The girls nowadays indulge in such exaggerated statements that one can never tell what they do mean. It wasn't so in my young days. Then a girl did not say she loved turnips in just the same tone that she might have said she loved her mother or her Saviour. Anne's conscience bore her up. "I really do love it," she said gently. "I've loved it ever since I saw it last fall. My 2 college chums and I want to keep house next year instead of boarding, so we are looking for a little place to rent, and when I saw that this house was to let I was so happy." "If you love it you can have it," said Miss Patty. "Maria and I decided today that we would not let it after all, because we did not like any of the people who have wanted it. We don't have to let it. We can afford to go to Europe even if we don't let it. It would help us out, but not for gold will I let my home pass into the possession of such people as have come here and looked at it. You are different. I believe you do love it and will be good to it. You can have it." If we can afford to pay what you ask for it," hesitated Anne. Miss Patty named the amount required. Anne and Priscilla looked at each other. Priscilla shook her head. "I'm afraid we can't afford quite so much," said Anne, choking back her disappointment. "You see, we are only college girls, and we are poor." "What were you thinking you could afford?" demanded Miss Patty, ceasing not to knit. Anne named her amount. Miss Patty nodded gravely. "That will do. As I told you, it is not strictly necessary that we should let it at all. We are not rich, but we have enough to go to Europe on. I have never been in Europe in my life, and never expected or wanted to go, but my niece there, Maria Spofford, has taken a fancy to go. Now, you know, a young person like Maria can't go globe-trotting alone." "No, I suppose not," murmured Anne, seeing that Miss Patty was quite solemnly in earnest. "Of course not. So I have to go along to look after her. I expect to enjoy it too. I'm 70 years old, but I'm not tired of living yet. I dare say I'd have gone to Europe before if the idea had occurred to me. We shall be away for 2 years, perhaps 3. We sail in June, and we shall send you the key and leave all in order for you to take possession when you choose. We shall pack away a few things we prize especially, but all the rest will be left." "Will you leave the china dogs?" asked Anne timidly. "Would you like me to?" "Oh, indeed, yes. They are delightful." A pleased expression came into Miss Patty's face. "I think a great deal of those dogs," she said proudly. "They are over 100 years old, and they have sat on either side of this fireplace ever since my brother Aaron brought them from London 50 years ago. Spofford Avenue was called after my brother Aaron." "A fine man he was," said Miss Maria, speaking for the first time. "Ah, you don't see the like of him nowadays." "He was a good uncle to you, Maria," said Miss Patty, with evident emotion. "You do well to remember him." "I shall always remember him," said Miss Maria solemnly. "I can see him this minute, standing there before that fire, with his hands under his coat tails, beaming on us." Miss Maria took out her handkerchief and wiped her eyes, but Miss Patty came resolutely back from the regions of sentiment to those of business. "I shall leave those dogs where they are, if you will promise to be very careful of them," she said. "Their names are Gog and Magog. Gog looks to the right and Magog to the left. And there's just one thing more. You don't object, I hope, to this house being called Patty's Place?" "No, indeed. We think that is one of the nicest things about it." "You have sense, I see," said Miss Patty, in a tone of great satisfaction. "Would you believe it? All the people who came here to rent the house wanted to know if they couldn't take the name off the gate during their occupation of it. I told them roundly that the name went with the house. This has been Patty's Place ever since my brother Aaron left it to me in his will, and Patty's Place it shall remain until I die and Maria dies. After that happens, the next possessor can call it any fool name he likes," concluded Miss Patty, much as she might have said, "after that, the deluge. And now, wouldn't you like to go over the house and see it all before we consider the bargain made?" Further exploration still further delighted the girls. Besides the big living room, there was a kitchen and a small bedroom downstairs. Upstairs were 3 rooms, 1 large and 2 small. Anne took an especial fancy to one of the small ones, looking out into the big pines, and hoped it would be hers. It was papered in pale blue, and had a little old-timey toilet table with sconces for candles. There was a diamond-paned window with a seat under the blue muslin frills that would be a satisfying spot for studying or dreaming.
"It's all so delicious that I know we are going to wake up and find it a fleeting vision of the night," said Priscilla as they went away. "Miss Patty and Miss Maria are hardly such stuff as dreams are made of," laughed Anne. "Can you fancy them globe-trotting, especially in those shawls and caps?" "I suppose they'll take them off when they really begin to trot," said Priscilla, "but I know they'll take their knitting with them everywhere. They simply couldn't be parted from it. They will walk about Westminster Abbey and knit, I feel sure. Meanwhile, Anne, we shall be living in Patty's Place, and on Spofford Avenue. I feel like a millionairess even now." "I feel like one of the morning stars that sang for joy," said Anne. Phil Gordon crept into 38 St. John's that night and flung herself on Anne's bed. "Girls, dear, I'm tired to death. I feel like the man without a country, or was it without a shadow? I forget which. Anyway, I've been packing up." "And I suppose you are worn out because you couldn't decide which things to pack first or where to put them," laughed Priscilla. "Exactly. And when I had got everything jammed in somehow, and my landlady and her maid had both sat on it while I locked it, I discovered I had packed a whole lot of things I wanted for Convocation at the very bottom. I had to unlock the old thing and poke and dive into it for an hour before I fished out what I wanted. I would get hold of something that felt like what I was looking for, and I'd yank it up, and it would be something else. No, Anne, I did not swear." "I didn't say you did." "Well, you looked it. But I admit my thoughts verged on the profane. And I have such a cold in the head. I can do nothing but sniffle, sigh, and sneeze. Isn't that alliterative agony for you? Queen Anne, do say something to cheer me up." "Remember that next Thursday night you'll be back in the land of Alec and Alonzo," suggested Anne. Phil shook her head dolefully. "More alliteration. No, I don't want Alec and Alonzo when I have a cold in the head. But what has happened to you two? Now that I look at you closely, you seem all lighted up with eternal iridescence. Why, you're actually shining! What's up?" "We are going to live in Patty's Place next winter," said Anne triumphantly. "Live, mark you, not board. We've rented it, and Stella Maynard is coming, and her aunt is going to keep house for us." Phil bounced up, wiped her nose, and fell on her knees before Anne. "Girls, girls, let me come too. Oh, I'll be so good. If there's no room for me, I'll sleep in the little doghouse in the orchard. I've seen it. Only let me come." "Get up, you goose." "I won't stir off my marrow bones till you tell me I can live with you next winter." Anne and Priscilla looked at each other. Then Anne said slowly, "Phil, dear, we'd love to have you, but we may as well speak plainly. I'm poor, Pris is poor, Stella Maynard is poor. Our housekeeping will have to be very simple and our table plain. You'd have to live as we would. Now, you are rich, and your boarding-house fare attests the fact." "Oh, what do I care for that?" demanded Phil tragically. "Better a dinner of herbs where your chums are than a stalled ox in a lonely boarding-house. Don't think I'm all stomach, girls. I'll be willing to live on bread and water with just a leetle jam, if you'll let me come." "And then," continued Anne, "there will be a good deal of work to be done. Stella's aunt can't do it all. We all expect to have our chores to do. Now you—" "Toil not, neither do I spin," finished Philippa. "But I'll learn to do things. You only have to show me once. I can make my own bed to begin with. And remember that, though I can't cook, I can keep my temper. That's something. And I never growl about the weather. That's more. Oh, please, please! I never wanted anything so much in my life, and this floor is awfully hard." "There's just one more thing," said Priscilla resolutely. "You, Phil, as all Redmond knows, entertain callers almost every evening. Now, at Patty's Place we can't do that. We have decided that we shall be at home to our friends on Friday evenings only. If you come with us, you'll have to abide by that rule." "Well, you don't think I'll mind that, do you? Why, I'm glad of it. I knew I should have had some such rule myself, but I hadn't enough decision to make it or stick to it. When I can shuffle off the responsibility on you, it will be a real relief. If you won't let me cast in my lot with you, I'll die of the disappointment and come back and haunt you. I'll camp on the very doorstep of Patty's Place, and you won't be able to go out or come in without falling over my spook." Again Anne and Priscilla exchanged eloquent looks. "Well," said Anne, "of course we can't promise to take you until we've consulted with Stella, but I don't think she'll object, and as far as we're concerned, you may come in glad welcome. "If you get tired of our simple life you can leave us, and no questions asked," added Priscilla. Phil sprang up, hugged them both jubilantly, and went on her way rejoicing. "I hope things will go right," said Priscilla soberly. "We must make them go right," avowed Anne. "I think Phil will fit into our 'appy little 'ome very well. Oh, Phil's a dear to rally around with and be chums. And of course, the more there are of us, the easier it will be on our slim purses. But how will she be to live with? You have to summer and winter with anyone before you know if she's livable or not." "Oh, well, we'll all be put to the test as far as that goes. And we must quit us like sensible folk, living and let live. Phil isn't selfish, though she's a little thoughtless, and I believe we will all get on beautifully in Patty's Place." End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sweet Pea. Chapter 11. The Round of Life. Anne was back in Avonlea with the luster of the Thorburn scholarship on her brow. People told her she hadn't changed much, in a tone which hinted they were surprised and a little disappointed she hadn't. Avonlea had not changed either, at least so it seemed at first. But as Anne sat in the Green Gables pew, on the first Sunday after her return, and looked over the congregation, she saw several little changes which, all coming home to her at once, made her realize that time did not quite stand still, even in Avonlea. A new minister was in the pulpit. In the pews more than one familiar face was missing forever. Old Uncle Abe, his prophesying over and done with, Mrs. Peter Sloane, who had sighed, it was to be hoped, for the last time, Timothy Cotton, who, as Mrs. Rachel Lynde said, had actually managed to die at last after practicing at it for 20 years, and old Josiah Sloane, who nobody knew in his coffin because he had his whiskers neatly trimmed, were all sleeping in the little graveyard behind the church. And Billy Andrews was married to Nettie Blewett. They appeared out that Sunday. When Billy, beaming with pride and happiness, showed his beplumed and besilked bride into the Harmon Andrews pew, Anne dropped her lids to hide her dancing eyes. She recalled the stormy winter night of the Christmas holidays when Jane had proposed for Billy. He certainly had not broken his heart over his rejection. Anne wondered if Jane had also proposed to Nettie for him, or if he had mustered up enough spunk to ask the fateful question himself. All the Andrews family seemed to share in his pride and pleasure, from Mrs. Harmon in the pew to Jane in the choir. Jane had resigned from the Avonlea school and intended to go west in the fall. "Can't get a beau in Avonlea, that's what," said Mrs. Rachel Lynde scornfully. "Says she thinks she'll have better health out west. I never heard her health was poor before." "Jane is a nice girl," Anne had said loyally. "She never tried to attract attention as some did." "Oh, she never chased the boys, if that's what you mean," said Mrs. Rachel. "But she'd like to be married just as much as anybody, that's what. What else would take her out west to some forsaken place whose only recommendation is that men are plenty and women scarce? Don't you tell me." But it was not at Jane Anne gazed that day in dismay and surprise. It was Ruby Gillis, who sat beside her in the choir. What had happened to Ruby? She was even handsomer than ever, but her blue eyes were too bright and lustrous, and the color of her cheeks was hectically brilliant. Besides, she was very thin. The hands that held her hymn book were almost transparent in their delicacy. "Is Ruby Gillis ill?" Anne asked of Mrs. Lynde as they went home from church. "Ruby Gillis is dying of galloping consumption," said Mrs. Lynde bluntly. "Everybody knows it except herself and her family. They won't give in. If you ask them, she's perfectly well. She hasn't been able to teach since she had that attack of congestion in the winter, but she says she's going to teach again in the fall, and she's after the White Sands School. She'll be in her grave, poor girl, when the White Sands School opens, that's what." Anne listened in shocked silence. Ruby Gillis, her old school chum, dying? Could it be possible? Of late years they had grown apart, but the old tie of schoolgirl intimacy was there, and made itself felt sharply in the tug the news gave at Anne's heartstrings. Ruby, the brilliant, the merry, the coquettish! It was impossible to associate the thought of her with anything like death. She had greeted Anne with gay cordiality after church, and urged her to come up the next evening. "I'll be away Tuesday and Wednesday evenings," she had whispered triumphantly. "There's a concert at Carmody and a party at White Sands. Herb Spencer's going to take me. He's my latest. Be sure to come up tomorrow. I'm dying for a good talk with you. I want to hear all about your doings at Redmond." Anne knew that Ruby meant she wanted to tell Anne all about her own recent flirtations, but she promised to go, and Diana offered to go with her. "I've been wanting to go to see Ruby for a long while," she told Anne when they left Green Gables the next evening, "but I really couldn't go alone. It's so awful to hear Ruby rattling on as she does, and pretending there's nothing the matter with her, even when she can hardly speak for coughing. She's fighting so hard for her life, and yet she hasn't any chance at all, they say." The girls walked silently down the red twilit road. The robins were singing vespers in the high tree-tops, filling the golden air with their jubilant voices. The silver fluting of the frogs came from marshes and ponds, over fields where seeds were beginning to stir with life, and thrilled to the sunshine and rain that drifted over them. The air was fragrant with the wild, sweet, wholesome smell of young raspberry copses. White mists were hovering in the silent hollows, and violet stars were shining bluely on the brooklands. "What a beautiful sunset," said Diana. "Look, Anne, it's just like a land in itself, isn't it? That long, low back of purple cloud is the shore, and the clear sky further on is like a golden sea. If we could sail to it in the moonshine boat Paul wrote of in his old composition, you remember? How nice it would be," said Anne, rousing from her reverie. "Do you think we could find all our yesterdays there, Diana? All our old springs and blossoms? The beds of flowers that Paul saw there are the roses that have bloomed for us in the past." "Don't," said Diana. "You make me feel as if we were old women with everything in life behind us." "I think I've almost felt as if we were since I heard about poor Ruby," said Anne. "If it is true that she is dying, any other sad thing might be true, too." "You don't mind calling in at Elisha Wright's for a moment, do you?" asked Diana. "Mother asked me to leave this little dish of jelly for Aunt Atossa." "Who is Aunt Atossa?" "Oh, haven't you heard? She's Mrs. Sampson Cody's of Spencervale, Mrs. Elisha Wright's aunt. She's father's aunt, too. Her husband died last winter, and she was left very poor and lonely, so the Wrights took her to live with them. Mother thought we ought to take her, but father put his foot down. Live with Aunt Atossa he would not." "Is she so terrible?" asked Anne absently. "You'll probably see what she's like before we can get away," said Diana significantly. "Father says she has a face like a hatchet. It cuts the air. But her tongue is sharper still." Late as it was, Aunt Atossa was cutting potato sets in the Wright kitchen. She wore a faded old wrapper, and her gray hair was decidedly untidy. Aunt Atossa did not like being caught in a kilter, so she went out of her way to be disagreeable. "Oh, so you're Anne Shirley," she said, when Diana introduced Anne. "I've heard of you." Her tone implied that she had heard nothing good. "Mrs. Andrews was telling me you were home. She said you had improved a good deal." There was no doubt Aunt Atossa thought there was plenty of room for further improvement. She ceased not from cutting sets with much energy. "Is it any use to ask you to sit down?" she inquired sarcastically. "Of course, there's nothing very entertaining here for you. The rest are all away." "Mother sent you this little pot of rhubarb jelly," said Diana pleasantly. "She made it today and thought you might like some." "Oh, thanks," said Aunt Atossa sourly. "I never fancy your mother's jelly. She always makes it too sweet. However, I'll try to worry some down. My appetite's been dreadful poor this spring. I'm far from well," continued Aunt Atossa solemnly, "but still I keep a-doing. People who can't work aren't wanted here. If it isn't too much trouble, will you be condescending enough to set the jelly in the pantry? I'm in a hurry to get these spuds done tonight. I suppose you two ladies never do anything like this. You'd be afraid of spoiling your hands." "I used to cut potato sets before we rented the farm," smiled Anne. "I do it yet," laughed Diana. "I cut sets 3 days last week. Of course," she added teasingly, "I did my hands up in lemon juice and kid gloves every night after it." Aunt Atossa sniffed. "I suppose you got that notion out of some of those silly magazines you read so many of. I wonder your mother allows you. But she always spoiled you. We all thought when George married her she wouldn't be a suitable wife for him."
Aunt Atossa sighed heavily, as if all forebodings upon the occasion of George Barry's marriage had been amply and darkly fulfilled. "Going, are you?" she inquired, as the girls rose. "Well, I suppose you can't find much amusement talking to an old woman like me. It's such a pity the boys ain't home." "We want to run in and see Ruby Gillis a little while," explained Diana. "Oh, anything does for an excuse, of course," said Aunt Atossa amiably. "Just whip in and whip out before you have time to say how-do decently. It's college airs, I suppose. You'd be wiser to keep away from Ruby Gillis. The doctors say consumption's catching. I always knew Ruby'd get something gadding off to Boston last fall for a visit. People who ain't content to stay home always catch something." "People who don't go visiting catch things too. Sometimes they even die," said Diana solemnly. "Then they don't have themselves to blame for it," retorted Aunt Atossa triumphantly. "I hear you are to be married in June, Diana." "There was no truth in that report," said Diana, blushing. "Well, don't put it off too long," said Aunt Atossa significantly. "You'll fade soon, your old complexion and hair. And the rites are terrible fickle. You ought to wear a hat, Miss Shirley. Your nose is freckling scandalous. My, but you are red-headed. Well, I suppose we're all as the Lord made us. Give Marilla Cuthbert my respects. She's never been to see me since I come to Avonlea, but I suppose I oughtn't to complain. The Cuthberts always did think themselves a cut higher than anyone else round here." "Oh, isn't she dreadful?" gasped Diana as they escaped down the lane. "She's worse than Mrs. Eliza Andrews," said Anne. "But then, think of living all your life with a name like Atossa. Wouldn't it sour almost anyone? She should have tried to imagine her name was Cordelia. It might have helped her a great deal." "It certainly helped me in the days when I didn't like Anne." "Josie Pye will be just like her when she grows up," said Diana. "Josie's mother and Aunt Atossa are cousins, you know. Oh dear, I'm glad that's over. She's so malicious. She seems to put a bad flavor in everything. Father tells such a funny story about her. One time they had a minister in Spencervale who was a very good spiritual man, but very deaf. He couldn't hear any ordinary conversation at all. Well, they used to have a prayer meeting on Sunday evenings, and all the church members present would get up and pray in turn or say a few words in some Bible verse. But one evening Aunt Atossa bounced up. She didn't either pray or preach. Instead, she lit into everybody else in the church and gave them a fearful raking down, calling them right out by name and telling them how they had all behaved and casting up all the quarrels and scandals of the past 10 years. Finally, she wound up by saying that she was disgusted with the Spencervale church, and she never meant to darken its door again, and she hoped a fearful judgment would come upon it. Then she sat down under breath, and the minister, who hadn't heard a word, immediately remarked in a very devout voice, "Amen! The Lord grant our dear sister's prayer!" You ought to hear Father tell the story. "Speaking of stories, Diana," remarked Anne in a significant confidential voice, "do you know that lately I have been wondering if I could write a short story, a story that would be good enough to be published?" "Why, of course you could," said Diana, after she had grasped the amazing suggestion. "You used to write perfectly thrilling stories years ago in our old story club." "Well, I hardly meant one of that kind of stories," smiled Anne. "I've been thinking about it a little of late, but I'm almost afraid to try, for if I should fail it would be too humiliating. I heard Priscilla say once that all Mrs. Morgan's first stories were rejected. But I'm sure yours wouldn't be, Anne, for it's likely editors have more sense nowadays. Margaret Burton, one of the junior girls at Redmond, wrote a story last winter, and it was published in the Canadian Woman. I really do think I should write one at least as good." "And will you have it published in the Canadian Woman?" "I might try one of the bigger magazines first. It all depends on what kind of a story I write." "What is it to be about?" "I don't know yet. I want to get hold of a good plot. I believe this is very necessary from an editor's point of view. The only thing I've settled on is the heroine's name. It is to be Averil Lester. Rather pretty, don't you think? Don't mention this to anyone, Diana. I haven't told anybody but you and Mr. Harrison. He wasn't very encouraging. He said there was far too much trash written nowadays as it was, and he'd expected something better of me after a year at college." "What does Mr. Harrison know about it?" demanded Diana scornfully. They found the Gillis home gay with lights and callers. Leonard Kimball of Spencervale and Morgan Bell of Carmody were glaring at each other across the parlor. Several merry girls had dropped in. Ruby was dressed in white, and her eyes and cheeks were very brilliant. She laughed and chattered incessantly, and after the other girls had gone she took Anne upstairs to display her new summer dresses.
I've a blue silk to make up yet, but it's a little heavy for summer wear. I think I'll leave it until the fall. I'm going to teach in White Sands, you know. How do you like my hat? That one you had on in church yesterday was real dinky, but I like something brighter for myself. Did you notice those two ridiculous boys downstairs? They've both come determined to sit each other out. I don't care a single bit about either of them, you know. Herb Spencer is the one I like. Sometimes I really do think he's Mr. Right. At Christmas I thought the Spencerville schoolmaster was that, but I found out something about him that turned me against him. He nearly went insane when I turned him down. I wish those two boys hadn't come tonight. I wanted to have a nice good talk with you, Anne, and tell you such heaps of things. You and I were always good chums, weren't we? Ruby slipped her arm about Anne's waist with a shallow little laugh, but just for a moment their eyes met, and behind all the luster of Ruby's Anne saw something that made her heart ache. "Come up often, won't you, Anne?" whispered Ruby. "Come alone. I want you." "Are you feeling quite well, Ruby?" "Me? Why, I'm perfectly well. I never felt better in my life. Of course, that congestion last winter pulled me down a little, but just see my color. I don't look much like an invalid, I'm sure." Ruby's voice was almost sharp. She pulled her arm away from Anne as if in resentment and ran downstairs, where she was gayer than ever, apparently so much absorbed in bantering her two swains that Diana and Anne felt rather out of it and soon went away. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sweet Pea. Chapter 12. Averil's Atonement. "What are you dreaming of, Anne?" The two girls were loitering one evening in a fairy hollow of the brook. Ferns nodded it, and little grasses were green, and wild pears hung finely scented white curtains around it. Anne roused herself from her reverie with a happy sigh. "I was thinking up my story, Diana." "Oh, have you really begun it?" cried Diana, all alight with eager interest in a moment. "Yes, I have only a few pages written, but I have it all pretty well thought out. I've had such time to get a suitable plot. None of the plots that suggested themselves suited a girl named Averil." "Couldn't you have changed her name?" "No, the thing was impossible. I tried to, but I couldn't do it, any more than I could change yours. Averil was so real to me that no matter what other name I tried to give her I just thought of her as Averil behind it all. But finally I got a plot that matched her. Then came the excitement of choosing names for all my characters. You have no idea how fascinating that is. I've lain awake for hours thinking over those names. The hero's name is Percival Dalrymple." "Have you named all the characters?" asked Diana wistfully. "If you hadn't, I was going to ask you to let me name one, just some unimportant person. I'd feel as if I had a share in the story then." "You may name the little hired boy who lived with the Lesters," conceded Anne. "He is not very important, but he is the only one left unnamed." "Call him Raymond Fitzosborne," suggested Diana, who had a store of such names laid away in her memory, relics of the old Story Club which she and Anne and Jane Andrews and Ruby Gillis had had in their school days. Anne shook her head doubtfully. "I'm afraid that is too aristocratic a name for a chore boy, Diana. I couldn't imagine a Fitzosborne feeding pigs and picking up chips, could you?" Diana didn't see why, if you had an imagination at all, you couldn't stretch it to the extent, but probably Anne knew best, and the chore boy was finally christened Robert Ray, to be called Bobby should occasion require. "How much do you suppose you'll get for it?" asked Diana. But Anne had not thought about this at all. She was in pursuit of fame, not filthy lucre, and her literary dreams were as yet untainted by mercenary considerations. "You'll let me read it, won't you?" pleaded Diana. "When it is finished I'll read it to you and Mr. Harrison, and I shall want you to criticize it severely. No one else shall see it until it is published." "How are you going to end it? Happily or unhappily?" "I'm not sure. I'd like it to end unhappily because that would be so much more romantic. But
I understand editors have a prejudice against sad endings. I heard Professor Hamilton say once that nobody but a genius should try to write an unhappy ending. And," concluded Anne modestly, "I'm anything but a genius." "Oh, I like happy endings best. You'd better let him marry her," said Diana, who, especially since her engagement to Fred, thought this was how every story should end. "But you like to cry over stories?" "Oh, yes, in the middle of them. But I like everything to come right at last." "I must have one pathetic scene in it," said Anne thoughtfully. "I might let Robert Ray be injured in an accident and have a death scene." "No, you mustn't kill Bobby off," declared Diana, laughing. "He belongs to me, and I want him to live and flourish. Kill somebody else if you have to." For the next fortnight Anne writhed or revelled, according to mood, in her literary pursuits. Now she would be jubilant over a brilliant idea, now despairing because some contrary character would not behave properly. Diana could not understand this. "Make them do as you want them to," she said. "I can't," mourned Anne. "Averil is such an unmanageable heroine. She will do and say things I never meant her to. Then that spoils everything that went before, and I have to write it all over again." Finally, however, the story was finished, and Anne read it to Diana in the seclusion of the porch gable. She had achieved her pathetic scene without sacrificing Robert Ray, and she kept a watchful eye on Diana as she read it. Diana rose to the occasion and cried properly, but when the end came she looked a little disappointed. "Why did you kill Maurice Lennox?" she asked reproachfully. "He was the villain," protested Anne. "He had to be punished." "I like him best of all," said unreasonable Diana. "Well, he's dead, and he'll have to stay dead," said Anne rather resentfully. "If I had let him live he'd have gone on persecuting Averil and Percival." "Yes, unless you had reformed him." "That wouldn't have been romantic, and besides, it would have made the story too long." "Well, anyway, it's a perfectly elegant story, Anne, and will make you famous, of that I'm sure. Have you got a title for it?" "Oh, I decided on the title long ago. I call it Averil's Atonement. Doesn't that sound nice and alliterative? Now, Diana, tell me candidly, did you see any faults in my story?" "Well," hesitated Diana, "that part where Averil makes the cake doesn't seem to me quite romantic enough to match the rest. It's just what anybody might do. Heroines shouldn't do cooking, I think." "Why, that is where the humor comes in, and it's one of the best parts of the whole story," said Anne. And it may be stated that in this she was quite right. Diana prudently refrained from any further criticism, but Mr. Harrison was much harder to please. First he had told her there was entirely too much description in the story. "Cut out all those flowery passages," he said unfeelingly. Anne had an uncomfortable conviction that Mr. Harrison was right, and she forced herself to expunge most of her beloved descriptions, though it took 3 rewritings before the story could be pruned down to please the fastidious Mr. Harrison. "I've left out all the descriptions but the sunset," she said at last. "I simply couldn't let it go. It was the best of them all." "It hasn't anything to do with the story," said Mr. Harrison, "and you shouldn't have laid the scene among rich city people. What do you know of them? Why didn't you lay it here in Avonlea, changing the name, of course? Or else Mrs. Rachel Lynde would probably think she was the heroine." "Oh, that would never have done," protested Anne. "Avonlea is the dearest place in the world, but it isn't quite romantic enough for the scene of a story." "I dare say there's been many a romance in Avonlea, and many a tragedy too," said Mr. Harrison dryly. "But your folks ain't like real folks anywhere. They talk too much and use too high-flown language. There's one place where that Dalrymple chap talks even on for 2 pages and never lets the girl get a word in edgeways. If he'd done that in real life she'd have pitched him." "I don't believe it," said Anne flatly. In her secret soul she thought that the beautiful poetical things said to Averil would win any girl's heart completely. Besides, it was gruesome to hear of Averil, the stately, queen-like Averil, pitching anyone. Averil declined her suitors. "Anyhow," resumed the merciless Mr. Harrison, "I don't see why Maurice Lennox didn't get her. He was twice the man the other is. He did bad things, but he did them. Percival hadn't any time for anything but mooning." Mooning. That was even worse than pitching. Maurice Lennox was the villain, said Anne indignantly. I don't see why everyone likes him better than Percival. Percival is too good. He's aggravating. Next time you write about a hero, put a little spice of human nature in him. Averil couldn't have married Maurice. He was bad. She'd have reformed him. You can reform a man. You can't reform a jellyfish, of course. Your story isn't bad. It's kind of interesting, I'll admit. But you're too young to write a story that would be worthwhile. Wait 10 years. Anne made up her mind that the next time she wrote a story she wouldn't ask anybody to criticize it. It was too discouraging. She would not read the story to Gilbert, although she told him about it. If it is a success, you'll see it when it is published, Gilbert, but if it is a failure, nobody shall ever see it. Marilla knew nothing about the venture. In imagination Anne saw herself reading a story out of a magazine to Marilla, entrapping her into praise of it, for in imagination all things are possible, and then triumphantly announcing herself as the author. One day Anne took to the post office a long, bulky envelope, addressed with the delightful confidence of youth and inexperience to the very biggest of the big magazines. Diana was excited over it as Anne herself. "How long do you suppose it will be before you hear from it?" she asked. "It shouldn't be longer than a fortnight. Oh, how happy and proud I will be if it is accepted!" "Of course it will be accepted, and they will likely ask you to send them more. You may be as famous as Mrs. Morgan some day, Anne, and then how proud I'll be of knowing you," said Diana, who possessed, at least, the striking merit of an unselfish admiration of the gifts and graces of her friends. A week of delightful dreaming followed, and then came a bitter awakening. One evening Diana found Anne in the porch gable with suspicious-looking eyes. On the table lay a long envelope and a crumpled manuscript. "Anne, your story hasn't come back!" cried Diana incredulously. "Yes, it has," said Anne shortly. "Well, that editor must be crazy. What reason did he give?" "No reason at all. There is just a printed slip saying that it wasn't found acceptable." "I never thought much of that magazine anyway," said Diana hotly. "The stories in it are not half as interesting as those in the Canadian Woman, although it costs so much more. I suppose the editor is prejudiced against anyone who isn't a Yankee. Don't be discouraged, Anne. Remember how Mrs. Morgan's stories came back. Send yours to the Canadian Women." "I believe I will," said Anne, plucking up heart. "And if it is published I'll send that American editor a marked copy. But I'll cut the sunset out. I believe Mr. Harrison was right." Out came the sunset, but in spite of this heroic mutilation the editor of the Canadian Woman sent Averil's Atonement back so promptly that the indignant Diana declared that it couldn't have been read at all, and vowed she was going to stop her subscription immediately. Anne took the second rejection with the calmness of despair. She locked the story away in the garret trunk where the old Story Club tales reposed, but first she yielded to Diana's entreaties and gave her a copy. "This is the end of my literary ambitions," she said bitterly. She never mentioned the matter to Mr. Harrison, but one evening he asked her bluntly if her story had been accepted. "No, the editor wouldn't take it," she answered briefly. Mr. Harrison looked sideways at the flushed, delicate profile. "Well, I suppose you'll keep on writing them," he said encouragingly. "No, I shall never try to write a story again," declared Anne with the hopeless finality of 19 when a door is shut in its face. "I wouldn't give up altogether," said Mr. Harrison reflectively. "I'd write a story once in a while, but I wouldn't pester editors with it. I'd write of people and places like I knew, and I'd make my characters talk everyday English, and I'd let the sun rise and set in the usual quiet way without much fuss over the fact. If I had to have villains at all, I'd give them a chance, Anne, I'd give them a chance. There are some terrible bad men in the world, I suppose, but you'd have to go a long piece to find them, though Mrs. Lynde believes we're all bad. But most of us has got a little decency somewhere in us. Keep on writing, Anne." "No, it was very foolish of me to attempt it. When I'm through Redmond I'll stick to teaching. I can teach. I can't write stories." "It'll be time for you to be getting a husband when you're through Redmond," said Mr. Harrison. "I don't believe in putting marrying off too long, like I did." Anne got up and marched home. There were times when Mr. Harrison was really intolerable. Pitching, mooning, and getting a husband. Ow.
End of chapter 12.
Chapter 13 of Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sweet Pea. Chapter 13. The Way of Transgressors. Davy and Dora were ready for Sunday school. They were going alone, which did not often happen, for Mrs. Lynde always attended Sunday school. But Mrs. Lynde had twisted her ankle and was lame, so she was staying home this morning. The twins were also to represent the family at church, for Anne had gone away the evening before to spend Sunday with friends in Carmody, and Marilla had one of her headaches. Davy came downstairs slowly. Dora was waiting in the hall for him, having been made ready by Mrs. Lynde. Davy had attended to his own preparations. He had a cent in his pocket for the Sunday school collection, and a 5-cent piece for the church collection. He carried his Bible in one hand and his Sunday school quarterly in the other. He knew his lesson and his golden text and his catechism question perfectly. Had he not studied them, perforce, in Mrs. Lynde's kitchen all last Sunday afternoon? Davy, therefore, should have been in a placid frame of mind. As a matter of fact, despite text and catechism, he was inwardly as a ravening wolf. Mrs. Lynde limped out of her kitchen as he joined Dora. "Are you clean?" she demanded severely. "Yes, all of me that shows," Davy answered with a defiant scowl. Mrs. Rachel sighed. She had her suspicions about Davy's neck and ears, but she knew that if she attempted to make a personal examination Davy would likely take to his heels, and she could not pursue him today. "Well, be sure you behave yourselves," she warned them. "Don't walk in the dust. Don't stop in the porch to talk to the other children. Don't squirm or wriggle in your places. Don't forget the golden text. Don't lose your collection or forget to put it in. Don't whisper at prayer time, and don't forget to pay attention to the sermon." Davy deigned no response. He marched away down the lane, followed by the meek Dora, but his soul seethed within. Davy had suffered, or thought he had suffered, many things at the hands and tongue of Mrs. Rachel Lynde since she had come to Green Gables, for Mrs. Lynde could not live with anybody, whether they were 9 or 90, without trying to bring them up properly. And it was only the preceding afternoon that she had interfered to influence Marilla against allowing Davy to go fishing with the Timothy Cottons. Davy was still boiling over this. As soon as he was out of the lane, Davy stopped and twisted his countenance into such an unearthly and terrific contortion that Dora, although she knew his gifts in that respect, was honestly alarmed lest he should never in the world be able to get it straightened out again. "Darn her!" exploded Davy. "Oh, Davy, don't swear!" gasped Dora in dismay. "Darn isn't swearing, not real swearing, and I don't care if it is," retorted Davy recklessly. "Well, if you must say dreadful words, don't say them on Sunday," pleaded Dora. Davy was as yet far from repentance, but in his secret soul he felt that perhaps he had gone a little too far. "I'm going to invent a swear word of my own," he declared. "God will punish you if you do," said Dora solemnly. "Then I think God is a mean old scamp," retorted Davy. "Doesn't he know a fellow must have some way of expressing his feelings?" "Davy!" said Dora. She expected that Davy would be struck down dead on the spot, but nothing happened. "Anyway, I ain't going to stand any more of Mrs. Lynde's bossing," spluttered Davy. "Anne and Marilla may have the right to boss me, but she hasn't. I'm going to do every single thing she told me not to do. You watch me." In grim, deliberate silence, while Dora watched him with the fascination of horror, Davy stepped off the green grass of the roadside, ankle deep, into the fine dust which 4 weeks of rainless weather had made on the road, and marched along in it, shuffling his feet viciously until he was enveloped in a hazy cloud. "That's the beginning," he announced triumphantly, "and I'm going to stop in the porch and talk as long as there's anybody to talk to. I'm going to squirm and wriggle and whisper, and I'm going to say I don't know the golden text. And I'm going to throw away both of my collections right now." And Davy hurled cent and nickel over Mr. Barry's fence with fierce delight. "Satan made you do that," said Dora reproachfully. "He didn't!" cried Davy indignantly. "I just thought it out for myself. And I've thought of something else. I'm not going to Sunday school or church at all. I'm going up to play with the Cottons. They told me yesterday they weren't going to Sunday school today because their mother was away and there was nobody to make them. Come along, Dora. We'll have a great time." "I don't want to go," protested Dora. You've got to, said Davy. If you don't come, I'll tell Marilla that Frank Bell kissed you in school last Monday. I couldn't help it. I didn't know he was going to, cried Dora, blushing scarlet. Well, you didn't slap him or seem a bit cross, retorted Davy. I'll tell her that, too, if you don't come. We'll take the short cut up this field. I'm afraid of those cows, protested poor Dora, seeking a prospect of escape. The very idea of your being scared of those cows, scoffed Davy. Why, they're both younger than you. They're bigger, said Dora. They won't hurt you. Come along now. This is great. When I grow up, I ain't going to bother going to church at all. I believe I can get to heaven by myself. You'll go to the other place if you break the Sabbath day, said unhappy Dora, following him sorely against her will. But Davy was not scared yet. Hell was very far off, and the delights of a fishing expedition with the Cottons were very near. He wished Dora had more spunk. She kept looking back as if she were going to cry every minute, and that spoiled a fellow's fun. Hang girls, anyway. Davy did not say darn this time, even in thought. He was not sorry, yet, that he had said it once, but it might be as well not to tempt the unknown powers too far in one day. The small Cottons were playing in their backyard, and hailed Davy's appearance with whoops of delight. Pete, Tommy, Adolphus, and Mirabel Cotton were all alone. Their mother and older sisters were away. Dora was thankful Mirabel was there at least. She had been afraid she would be alone in a crowd of boys. Mirabel was almost as bad as a boy. She was so noisy and sunburned and reckless. But at least she wore dresses. We've come to cove fishing, announced Davy. Whoop! Yelled the Cottons. They rushed away to dig worms at once, Mirabel leading the van with a tin can. Dora could have sat down and cried. Oh, if only that hateful Frank Bell had never kissed her! Then she could have defied Davy and gone to her beloved Sunday school. They dared not, of course, go fishing on the pond, where they would be seen by people going to church. They had to resort to the brook in the woods behind the cotton house. But it was full of trout, and they had a glorious time that morning. At least the Cottons certainly had, and Davy seemed to have it. Not being entirely bereft of prudence, he had discarded boots and stockings, and borrowed Tommy Cotton's overalls. Thus accoutred, bog and marsh and undergrowth had no terrors for him. Dora was frankly and manifestly miserable. She followed the others in their peregrinations from pool to pool, clasping her Bible and quarterly tightly, and thinking with bitterness of soul of her beloved class where she should be sitting that very moment before a teacher she adored. Instead, here she was roaming the woods with those half-wild Cottons, trying to keep her boots clean and her pretty white dress free from rents and stains. Mirabel had offered the loan of an apron, but Dora had scornfully refused. The trout bit as they always do on Sundays. In an hour the transgressors had all the fish they wanted, so they returned to the house, much to Dora's relief. She sat primly on a hen coop in the yard, while the others played an uproarious game of tag, and then they all climbed to the top of the pig house roof and cut their initials on the saddleboard. The flat-roofed hen house and a pile of straw beneath gave Davy another inspiration. They spent a splendid half-hour climbing on the roof and diving off into the straw with whoops and yells. But even unlawful pleasures must come to an end. When the rumble of wheels over the pond bridge told that people were going home from church, even Davy knew they must go. He discarded Tommy's overalls, resumed his own rightful attire, and turned away from his string of trout with a sigh. No use to think of taking them home. "Well, hadn't we a splendid time?" he demanded defiantly as they went down the hill field. "I hadn't," said Dora flatly, "and I don't believe you had, really, either," she added, with a flash of insight that was not to be expected of her. "I had so!" cried Davy, but in the voice of one who doth protest too much. "No wonder you hadn't, just sitting there like a mule." "I ain't going to associate with the Cottons," said Dora loftily. "The Cottons are all right," retorted Davy, "and they have far better times than we have. They do just as they please and say just what they like before everybody. I'm going to do that too after this." "There are lots of things you wouldn't dare say before everybody," averred Dora. "No, there isn't. There is, too." "Would you?" demanded Dora gravely. "Would you say tomcat before the minister?" This was a staggerer. Davy was not prepared for such a concrete example of the freedom of speech, but one did not have to be consistent with Dora. "Of course not," he admitted sulkily. "Tomcat isn't a holy word. I wouldn't mention such an animal before a minister at all." "But if you had to," persisted Dora. "I'd call it a Thomas pussy," said Davy.
I think gentleman cat would be much more polite, reflected Dora. You thinking, retorted Davy with withering scorn. Davy was not feeling comfortable, though he would have died before he admitted it to Dora. Now that the exhilaration of truant delights had died away, his conscience was beginning to give him salutary twinges. After all, perhaps it would have been better to have gone to Sunday school and church. Mrs. Lynde might be bossy, but there was always a box of cookies in her kitchen cupboard, and she was not stingy. At this inconvenient moment, Davy remembered that when he had torn his new school pants the week before, Mrs. Lynde had mended them beautifully and never said a word to Marilla about them. But Davy's cup of iniquity was not yet full. He was to discover that one sin demands another to cover it. They had dinner with Mrs. Lynde that day, and the first thing she asked Davy was, "Were all your class in Sunday school today?"
"Yes'm," said Davy with a gulp. "All were there, 'cept one."
"Did you say your golden text and catechism?"
"Yes'm."
"Did you put your collection in?"
"Yes'm."
"Was Mrs. Malcolm MacPherson in church?"
"I don't know."
This, at least, was the truth, thought wretched Davy. "Was the Ladies' Aid announced for next week?"
"Yes'm," quakingly.
"Was prayer meeting?"
I don't know."
"You should know. You should listen more attentively to the announcements. What was Mr. Harvey's text?" Davy took a frantic gulp of water and swallowed it, and the last protest of conscience together. He glibly recited an old golden text learned several weeks ago. Fortunately, Mrs. Lynde now stopped questioning him, but Davy did not enjoy his dinner. He could only eat one helping of pudding. "What's the matter with you?" demanded justly astonished Mrs. Lynde. "Are you sick?"
"No," muttered Davy.
"You look pale. You'd better keep out of the sun this afternoon," admonished Mrs. Lynde. "Do you know how many lies you told Mrs. Lynde?" asked Dora reproachfully, as soon as they were alone after dinner. Davy, goaded to desperation, turned fiercely. "I don't know and I don't care," he said. "You just shut up, Dora Keith." Then poor Davy betook himself to a secluded retreat behind the woodpile to think over the way of transgressors. Green Gables was wrapped in darkness and silence when Anne reached home. She lost no time going to bed, for she was very tired and sleepy. There had been several Avonlea jollifications the preceding week involving rather late hours. Anne's head was hardly on her pillow before she was half asleep, but just then the door was softly opened and a pleading voice said, "Anne." Anne sat up drowsily. "Davy, is that you? What's the matter?" A white-clad figure flung itself across the floor and onto the bed.
"Anne," sobbed Davy, getting his arms about her neck, "I'm awful glad you're home. I couldn't go to sleep till I'd told somebody."
"Told somebody what?"
"How miserable I am."
"Why are you miserable, dear?"
"'Cause I was so bad today, Anne. Oh, I was awful bad. Badder'n I ever been yet." "What did you do?" "Oh, I'm afraid to tell you. You'll never like me again, Anne. I couldn't say my prayers tonight. I couldn't tell God what I'd done. I was ashamed to have him know."
"But he knew anyway, Davy."
"That's what Dora said. But I thought p'raps he mightn't have noticed just at the time. Anyway, I'd rather tell you first."
"What is it you did?"
Out it all came in a rush. I run away from Sunday school, and went fishing with the Cottons, and I told ever so many whoppers to Mrs. Lynde, oh, most half a dozen, and I said a swear word, Anne, a pretty near swear word anyhow, and I called God names."
There was silence. Davy didn't know what to make of it. Was Anne so shocked that she never would speak to him again?
"Anne, what are you going to do to me?" he whispered.
"Nothing, dear. You've been punished already, I think."
"No, I haven't. Nothing's been done to me."
"You've been very unhappy ever since you did wrong, haven't you?" "You bet," said Davy emphatically. "That was your conscience punishing you, Davy."
"What's my conscience? I want to know."
"It's something in you, Davy, that always tells you when you are doing wrong and makes you unhappy if you persist in doing it. Haven't you noticed that?"
"Yes, but I didn't know what it was. I wish I didn't have it. I'd have lots more fun. Where is my conscience, Anne? I want to know. Is it in my stomach?"
"No, it's in your soul," answered Anne, thankful for the darkness, since gravity must be preserved in serious matters. I suppose I can't get clear of it then, said Davy with a sigh. Are you going to tell Marilla and Mrs. Lynde on me, Anne?
No, dear, I'm not going to tell anyone. You are sorry you were naughty, aren't you?
You bet!
And you'll never be bad like that again?
No, but, added Davy cautiously, I might be bad some other way.
You won't say naughty words or run away on Sundays or tell falsehoods to cover up your sins?
No, it doesn't pay, said Davy.
Well, Davy, just tell God you are sorry and ask him to forgive you.
Have you forgiven me, Anne?
Yes, dear.
Then, said Davy joyously, I don't care much whether God does or not.
Davy!
Oh, I'll ask him, said Davy quickly, scrambling off the bed, convinced by Anne's tone that he must have said something dreadful. I don't mind asking him, Anne.
Please, God, I'm awful sorry I behaved bad today, and I'll try to be good on Sunday as always, and please forgive me. There now, Anne.
Well, now, run off to bed like a good boy.
All right. Say, I don't feel miserable anymore. I feel fine. Good night.
Good night. Anne slipped down on her pillows with a sigh of relief. Oh, how sleepy she was! In another second— Anne! Davy was back again by her bed. Anne dragged her eyes open. What is it now, dear? She asked, trying to keep a note of impatience out of her voice.
Anne, have you ever noticed how Mr. Harrison spits? Do you suppose if I practice hard I can learn to spit just like him?
Anne sat up. Davy Keith, she said, go straight to your bed and don't let me catch you out of it again tonight. Go now. Davy went, and stood not upon the order of his going. End of chapter 13.
Chapter 14 of Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sweet Pea. Chapter 14. The Summons. Anne was sitting with Ruby Gillis in the Gillis garden after the day had crept lingeringly through it and was gone. It had been a warm, smoky summer afternoon. The world was in a splendor of outflowering. The idle valleys were full of hazes. The woodways were pranked with shadows and the fields with the purple of the asters. Anne had given up a moonlight drive to the White Sands beach that she might spend the evening with Ruby. She had so spent many evenings that summer, although she often wondered what good it did anyone, and sometimes went home deciding that she could not go again. Ruby grew paler as the summer waned. The White Sands school was given up. Her father thought it better that she shouldn't teach until New Year's, and the fancy work she loved oftener and oftener fell from hands grown too weary for it. But she was always gay, always hopeful, always chattering and whispering of her folks and their revelries and despairs. It was this that made Anne's visits hard for her. What had once been silly or amusing was gruesome. Now it was death peering through a wilful mask of life. Yet Ruby seemed to cling to her, and never let her go until she had promised to come again soon. Mrs. Lynde grumbled about Anne's frequent visits, and declared she would catch consumption. Even Marilla was dubious. "Every time you go to see Ruby you come home looking tired out," she said. "It's so very sad and dreadful," said Anne in a low tone. "Ruby doesn't seem to realize her condition in the least. And yet I somehow feel she needs help, craves it, and I want to give it to her and can't. All the time I'm with her I feel as if I were watching her struggle with an invisible foe, trying to push it back with such feeble resistance as she has. That is why I come home tired." But tonight Anne did not feel this so keenly. Ruby was strangely quiet. She said not a word about parties and drives and dresses and fellows. She lay in the hammock with her untouched work beside her, and a white shawl wrapped about her thin shoulders. Her long yellow braids of hair—how Anne had envied those beautiful braids in old school days!—lay on either side of her. She had taken the pins out. They made her head ache, she said. The hectic flush was gone for the time, leaving her pale and childlike. The moon rose in the silvery sky, empearling the clouds around her. Below, the pond shimmered in its hazy radiance. Just beyond the Gillis homestead was the church, with the old graveyard beside it. The moonlight shone on the white stones, bringing them out in clear-cut relief against the dark trees behind.
"How strange the graveyard looks by moonlight!" said Ruby suddenly. "How ghostly!" she shuddered. "Anne, it won't be long now before I'll be lying over there. You and Diana and all the rest will be going about full of life, and I'll be there in the old graveyard, dead." The surprise of it bewildered Anne. For a few moments she could not speak. "You know it's so, don't you?" said Ruby insistently. "Yes, I know," answered Anne in a low tone. "Dear Ruby, I know." "Everybody knows it," said Ruby bitterly. "I know it. I've known it all summer, though I wouldn't give in. And oh, Anne," she reached out and caught Anne's hand pleadingly, impulsively, "I don't want to die. I'm afraid to die." "Why should you be afraid, Ruby?" asked Anne quietly. Because, oh, I'm not afraid but that I'll go to heaven, Anne. I'm a church member. But it'll be all so different, I think, and I get so frightened and homesick. Heaven must be very beautiful, of course. The Bible says so, but Anne, it won't be what I'm used to." Through Anne's mind drifted an intrusive recollection of a funny story she had heard Philippa Gordon tell, the story of some old man who had said very much the same thing about the world to come. It had sounded funny then. She remembered how she and Priscilla had laughed over it. But it did not seem in the least humorous now, coming from Ruby's pale, trembling lips. It was sad, tragic, and true. Heaven could not be what Ruby had been used to. There had been nothing in her gay, frivolous life, her shallow ideals and aspirations, to fit her for that great change, or make the life to come seem to her anything but alien and unreal and undesirable. Anne wondered helplessly what she could say that would help her. Could she say anything? "I think, Ruby," she began hesitatingly, for it was difficult for Anne to speak to anyone of the deepest thoughts of her heart, or the new ideas that had vaguely begun to shape themselves in her mind concerning the great mysteries of life here and hereafter, superseding her old childish conceptions, and it was hardest of all to speak of them to such as Ruby Gillis. "I think, perhaps, we have very mistaken ideas about heaven, what it is and what it holds for us. I don't think it can be so very different from life here as most people seem to think. I believe we'll just go on living a good deal as we live here, and be ourselves just the same, only it will be easier to be good, and to follow the highest. All the hindrances and perplexities will be taken away, and we shall see clearly. Don't be afraid, Ruby." "I can't help it," said Ruby pitifully. "Even if what you say about heaven is true, and you can't be sure, it may be only that imagination of yours, it won't be just the same. It can't be. I want to go on living here. I'm so young, Anne. I haven't had my life. I've fought so hard to live, and it isn't any use. I have to die and leave everything I care for." Anne sat in a pain that was almost intolerable. She could not tell comforting falsehoods, and all that Ruby said was so horribly true. She was leaving everything she cared for. She had laid up her treasures on earth only. She had lived solely for the little things of life, the things that pass, forgetting the great things that go onward into eternity, bridging the gulf between the two lives, and making of death a mere passing from one dwelling to the other, from twilight to unclouded day. God would take care of her there, Anne believed. She would learn, but now it was no wonder her soul clung in blind helplessness to the only things she knew and loved. Ruby raised herself on her arm and lifted up her bright, beautiful eyes to the moonlit skies. "I want to live," she said in a trembling voice. "I want to live like other girls. I want to be married, Anne, and have little children. You know I always loved babies, Anne. I couldn't say this to anyone but you. I know you understand. And then poor Herb, he loves me and I love him, Anne. The others meant nothing to me, but he does. And if I could live I would be his wife and be so happy. Oh, Anne, it's hard." Ruby sank back on her pillows and sobbed convulsively. Anne pressed her hand in an agony of sympathy, silent sympathy, which perhaps helped Ruby more than broken, imperfect words could have done. But presently she grew calmer and her sobs ceased. "I'm glad I've told you this, Anne," she whispered. "It has helped me just to say it all out. I've wanted to all summer. Every time you came, I wanted to talk it over with you, but I couldn't. It seemed as if it would make death so sure if I said I was going to die, or if anyone else said it or hinted it. I wouldn't say it or even think it. In the daytime, when people were around me and everything was cheerful, it wasn't so hard to keep from thinking of it. But in the night when I couldn't sleep, it was so dreadful, Anne. I couldn't get away from it then. Death just came and stared me in the face, until I got so frightened I could have screamed. But you won't be frightened any more, Ruby, will you? You'll be brave, and believe that all is going to be well with you. I'll try. I'll think over what you have said and try to believe it. And you'll come up as often as you can, won't you, Anne? Yes, dear. It won't be very long now, Anne. I feel sure of that, and I'd rather have you than anyone else. I always liked you best of all the girls I went to school with. You were never jealous or mean, like some of them were. Poor Em White was up to see me yesterday. You remember Em and I were such chums for 3 years when we went to school? And then we quarreled the time of the school concert. We've never spoken to each other since. Wasn't it silly? Anything like that seems silly now. But Em and I made up the old quarrel yesterday. She said she'd have spoken years ago, only she thought I wouldn't. And I never spoke to her because I was sure she wouldn't speak to me. Isn't it strange how people misunderstand each other, Anne? Most of the trouble in life comes from misunderstanding, I think, said Anne. I must go now, Ruby. It's getting late, and you shouldn't be out in the damp. You'll come up soon again? Yes, very soon, and if there's anything I can do to help you, I'll be so glad. I know. You have helped me already. Nothing seems quite so dreadful now. Good night, Anne. Good night, dear. Anne walked home very slowly in the moonlight. The evening had changed something for her. Life held a different meaning, a deeper purpose. On the surface it would go on just the same, but the deeps had been stirred. It must not be with her as with poor butterfly Ruby. When she came to the end of one life, it must not be to face the next with shrinking terror of something wholly different, something for which accustomed thought and ideal and aspiration had unfitted her. The little things of life, sweet and excellent in their place, must not be the things lived for. The highest must be sought and followed. The life of heaven must be begun here on earth. That good night in the garden was for all time. Anne never saw Ruby in life again. The next night the AVIS gave a farewell party to Jane Andrews before her departure for the West. And while light feet danced and bright eyes laughed and merry tongues chattered, there came a summons to a soul in Avonlea that might not be disregarded or evaded. The next morning the word went from house to house that Ruby Gillis was dead. She had died in her sleep, painlessly and calmly, and on her face was a smile, as if, after all, death had come as a kindly friend to lead her over the threshold, instead of the grisly phantom she had dreaded. Mrs. Rachel Lynde said emphatically after the funeral that Ruby Gillis was the handsomest corpse she had ever laid eyes on. Her loveliness, as she lay, white-clad among the delicate flowers that Anne had placed about her, was remembered and talked of for years in Avonlea. Ruby had always been beautiful, but her beauty had been of the earth, earthy. It had had a certain insolent quality in it, as if it flaunted itself in the beholder's eye. Spirit had never shone through it, intellect had never refined it. But death had touched it and consecrated it, bringing out delicate modellings and purity of outline never seen before, doing what life and love and great sorrow and deep womanhood joys might have done for Ruby. Anne, looking down through a mist of tears at her old playfellow, thought she saw the face God had meant Ruby to have, and remembered it so always. Mrs. Gillis called Anne aside into a vacant room before the funeral procession left the house, and gave her a small packet. "I want you to have this," she sobbed. "Ruby would have liked you to have it. It's the embroidered centerpiece she was working at. It isn't quite finished. The needle is sticking in it just where her poor little fingers put it the last time she laid it down the afternoon before she died." "There's always a piece of unfinished work left," said Mrs. Lynde with tears in her eyes. "But I suppose there's always someone to finish it." "How difficult it is to realize that one we have always known can really be dead," said Anne, as she and Diana walked home. "Ruby is the first of our schoolmates to go. One by one, sooner or later, all the rest of us must follow." Yes, I suppose so, said Diana uncomfortably. She did not want to talk of that. She would have preferred to have discussed the details of the funeral, the splendid white velvet casket Mr. Gillis had insisted on having for Ruby. The Gillises must always make a splurge, even at funerals, quoth Mrs. Rachel Lynde. Herb Spencer's sad face, the uncontrolled hysteric grief of one of Ruby's sisters, but Anne would not talk of these things. She seemed wrapped in a reverie in which Diana felt lonesomely that she had neither lot nor part. Ruby Gillis was a great girl to laugh, said Davy suddenly. Will she laugh as much in heaven as she did in Avonlea, Anne? I want to know. Yes, I think she will, said Anne. Oh, Anne, protested Diana with a rather shocked smile. Well, why not, Diana? Said Anne seriously. Do you think we'll never laugh in heaven? Oh, I don't know, floundered Diana. It doesn't seem right, somehow. You know it's rather dreadful to laugh in church. But heaven won't be like church all the time, said Anne. I hope it ain't, said Davy emphatically. If it is, I don't want to go. Church is awful dull. Anyway, I don't mean to go for ever so long. I mean to live to be 100 years old like Mr. Thomas Blewett of White Sands. He says he's lived so long 'cause he always smoked tobacco and it killed all the germs. Can I smoke tobacco pretty soon, Anne? No, Davy, I hope you'll never use tobacco, said Anne absently. What'll you feel like if the germs kill me then? Demanded Davy. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sweet Pea. Chapter 15. A Dream Turned Upside Down. Just one more week and we go back to Redmond, said Anne. She was happy at the thought of returning to work, classes, and Redmond friends. Pleasing visions were also being woven around Patty's Place. There was a warm, pleasant sense of home in the thought of it, even though she had never lived there. But the summer had been a very happy one, too. A time of glad living with summer suns and skies, a time of keen delight in wholesome things, a time of renewing and deepening of old friendships, a time in which she had learned to live more nobly, to work more patiently, to play more heartily. All life lessons are not learned at college, she thought. Life teaches them everywhere. But alas, the final week of that pleasant vacation was spoiled for Anne by one of those impish happenings which are like a dream turned upside down. Been writing any more stories lately? Inquired Mr. Harrison genially one evening, when Anne was taking tea with him and Mrs. Harrison. No, answered Anne rather crisply. Well, no offense meant. Mrs. Hiram Sloane told me the other day that a big envelope addressed to the Rollings Reliable Baking Powder Company of Montreal had been dropped into the post office box a month ago, and she suspicioned that somebody was trying for the prize they'd offered for the best story that introduced the name of their baking powder. She said it wasn't addressed in your writing, but I thought maybe it was you. Indeed, no. I saw the prize offer, but I'd never dream of competing for it. I think it would be perfectly disgraceful to write a story to advertise a baking powder. It would be almost as bad as Judson Parker's patent medicine fence. So spake Anne loftily, little dreaming of the valley of humiliation awaiting her. That very evening Diana popped into the porch gable, bright-eyed and rosy-cheeked, carrying a letter. "Oh, Anne, here's a letter for you. I was at the office, so I thought I'd bring it along. Do open it quick. If it's what I believe it is, I shall be just wild with delight." Anne, puzzled, opened the letter and glanced over the typewritten contents. Miss Anne Shirley, Green Gables, Avonlea, P.E. Island. Dear Madame, we have much pleasure in informing you that your charming story, Averil's Atonement, has won the prize of $25 offered in our recent competition. We enclose the check herewith. We are arranging for the publication of the story in several prominent Canadian newspapers, and we also intend to have it printed in pamphlet form for distribution among our patrons. Thanking you for the interest you have shown in our enterprise, we remain, yours very truly, the Rollings Reliable Baking Powder Company. "I don't understand," said Anne blankly.
Diana clapped her hands. "Oh, I knew it would win the prize. I was sure of it. I sent your story into the competition, Anne."
Diana Barry.
"Yes, I did," said Diana gleefully, perching herself on the bed. "When I saw the offer I thought of your story in a minute, and at first I thought I'd ask you to send it in. But then I was afraid you wouldn't, you had so little faith left in it. So I just decided I'd send the copy you gave me, and say nothing about it. Then if it didn't win the prize, you'd never know and you wouldn't feel badly over it, because the stories that failed were not to be returned, and if it did you'd have such a delightful surprise." Diana was not the most discerning of mortals, but just at this moment it struck her that Anne was not looking exactly overjoyed. The surprise was there beyond doubt, but where was the delight? "Why, Anne, you don't seem a bit pleased!" she exclaimed. Anne instantly manufactured a smile and put it on. "Of course I couldn't be anything but pleased over your unselfish wish to give me pleasure," she said slowly. "But you know, I'm so amazed I can't realize it, and I don't understand. There wasn't a word in my story about Anne choked a little over the word baking powder." "Oh, I put that in," said Diana, reassured. "It was easy as a wink. And of course my experience in our old story club helped me. You know the scene where Averil makes the cake? Well, I just stated that she used the Rollings Reliable in it, and that was why it turned out so well, and then in the last paragraph, where Percival clasps Averil in his arms and says, 'Sweetheart, the beautiful coming years will bring us the fulfillment of our home of dreams,' I added, 'in which we will never use any baking powder except Rollings Reliable.'" "Oh!" gasped poor Anne, as if someone had dashed cold water on her. "And you've won the $25," continued Diana jubilantly. "Why, I heard Priscilla say once that the Canadian woman only pays $5 for a story." Anne held out the hateful pink slip in shaking fingers. "I can't take it. It's yours by right, Diana. You sent the story in and made the alterations. I would certainly never have sent it. So you must take the check." "I'd like to see myself," said Diana scornfully. "Why, what I did wasn't any trouble. The honor of being a friend of the prize winner is enough for me. Well, I must go. I should have gone straight home from the post office, for we have company. But I simply had to come and hear the news. I'm so glad for your sake, Anne." Anne suddenly bent forward, put her arms about Diana, and kissed her cheek. "I think you are the sweetest and truest friend in the world, Diana," she said with a little tremble in her voice, "and I assure you I appreciate the motive of what you've done." Diana, pleased and embarrassed, got herself away, and poor Anne, after flinging the innocent check into her bureau drawer as if it were blood money, cast herself on her bed and wept tears of shame and outraged sensibility. Oh, she could never live this down, never! Gilbert arrived at dusk, brimming over with congratulations, for he had called at Orchard Slope and heard the news. But his congratulations died on his lips at sight of Anne's face. "Why, Anne, what is the matter? I expected to find you radiant over winning Rollings Reliable Prize. Good for you!" "Oh, Gilbert!" "Not you!" implored Anne in a to brute tone. "I thought you would understand. Can't you see how awful this is?" "I must confess I can't. What is wrong?" "Everything," moaned Anne. "I feel as if I were disgraced forever. What do you think a mother would feel like if she found her child tattooed over with a baking powder advertisement? I feel just the same. I loved my poor little story, and I wrote it out of the best that was in me, and it is sacrilege to have it degraded to the level of a baking powder advertisement. Don't you remember what Professor Hamilton used to tell us in the literature class at Queen's? He said we were never to write a word for low or unworthy motive, but always to cling to the very highest ideals. What will he think when he hears I've written a story to advertise Rollings Reliable? And oh, when it gets out at Redmond, think how I'll be teased and laughed at." "That you won't," said Gilbert, wondering uneasily if it were that confounded junior's opinion in particular over which Anne was worried. "The Reds will think just as I thought, that you, being like 9 out of 10 of us, not overburdened with worldly wealth, had taken this way of earning an honest penny to help yourself through the year. I don't see that there's anything low or unworthy about that, or anything ridiculous either.
One would rather write masterpieces of literature, no doubt, but meanwhile board and tuition fees have to be paid." The common sense, matter of fact view of the case cheered Anne a little. At least, it removed her dread of being laughed at, though the deeper hurt of an outraged ideal remained.
End of chapter 15.